They wore crowns, but never escaped judgment. Some were feared, others adored, many loathed, and a few rewrote the rules just to watch them burn. These are not bedtime monarchs and fairy tales. These are the 25 most controversial royals in English history, kings and queens whose scandals, betrayals, and rebellions still haunt the throne. What happens when the divine right meets human failure? You're about to find out. Before we dive in, if twisted royal history is your kind of chaos, hit subscribe and stay haunted with us. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Midnight rabbit holes, afternoon distractions. We're not judging, just curious who else is wandering into the past with us. 1. King John of England. It begins with a death. It often does. In the year 1199, a man lies dying from an arrow wound in a remote French castle. That man is King Richard I, the Lionheart, a mythic warrior, absentee monarch, and accidental martyr to English nostalgia. And from the shadow of his deathbed emerges his youngest brother, John. Not beloved, not heroic, not expected, but available. This, in many ways, would be John's great strength, being the one who was still around after everyone else had either died in battle, fled the court, or been deemed untrustworthy. He was Plan D in a royal family that treated children like chess pieces and loyalty like a variable interest rate. When John took the throne in 1199, he did so not with applause, but with suspicion, among nobles, among foreign rulers, and it seems, even among his own blood. And he would repay that suspicion in full. John was, from the very beginning, a monarch whose controversies were not just byproducts of power, but tools of it. Where others consolidated their rule through charisma or reform, John used fear, debt, and bureaucracy. He turned the English crown into something sharp and transactional, and for that, he is remembered as a tyrant. But peel back the villain cape embroidered by Shakespeare in 19th century schoolbooks, and what you get is something even darker. A man who may not have been evil, but was worse. Predictable in his paranoia, petty in his control, and entirely devoid of moral glamour. He lost Normandy. That's how the downward spiral began, at least on paper. In 1204, John's feeble attempts to retain the Angevin Empire collapsed, and the vast lands once held in northern France were swept away by Philip II of France. For a medieval king, land was legitimacy. John hemorrhaged both, and the way he responded only made things worse. Instead of re-strategizing, John tightened his grip on England with tax schemes and legal punishments that felt more like extortion than policy. The barons, who had once backed his claim to the throne, now found themselves footing the bill for a war already lost. If you were wealthy, noble, and breathing in the early 13th century, King John likely made your life miserable. If you were poor, your life was already miserable, but now it was also more expensive. John's royal revenue came not just from taxes, but from aggressive fines, random fees, and targeted seizures of land from nobles who fell out of favor. He sold justice to the highest bidder, ignored legal precedents when they were inconvenient, and treated baronial loyalty like a rental agreement. Then there was the Church. In 1207, Pope Innocent III tried to install a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. John refused. The Pope excommunicated him, and in a remarkable act of medieval brinkmanship, John responded by seizing church lands, locking down religious authority, and running England like a godless state for years. To many chroniclers, this was the final straw. It wasn't just tyranny now, it was spiritual warfare. To defy the Pope was to threaten the very soul of the kingdom. Pilgrims feared damnation. Bishops went silent. And yet, John held firm, not out of principle, he didn't have those, but out of sheer defiant pride. He only relented in 1213, when the looming threat of French invasion forced his hand. In a maneuver both humiliating and deeply on-brand, John not only submitted to the Pope, but offered England itself as a papal fief. England was no longer just ruled by the king. It was, symbolically at least, owned by the Church. In medieval PR terms, this was catastrophic. It confirmed what many already suspected, that John was willing to mortgage anything, his honor, his sovereignty, his people, for temporary advantage. But the real explosion came 2 years later. The year of the Magna Carta, the great pause in the rhythm of royal absolutism. The barons, fed up with John's fiscal tyranny, legal abuses, and strategic blunders, marched in rebellion and seized London. John, militarily cornered and diplomatically isolated, agreed to negotiations at Runnymede. There, he was forced to affix his royal seal to a document that would become one of the most mythologized contracts in Western history. Except it wasn't really a contract between king and people. It was between a cornered monarch and a group of warlords trying to protect their own wealth and rights. Clause by clause, the Magna Carta limited royal power, not in the name of liberty, but in the name of elite security. And yet, in the centuries that followed, this pragmatic political fix would be retrofitted into the blueprint for modern constitutionalism. Irony has a long half-life. Of course, John had no intention of honoring it. He renounced the Magna Carta almost immediately, with papal backing. Civil war followed. The country fractured, and John, ever the tragicomic character in his own drama, died in 1216 not on the battlefield, but from dysentery, after gorging himself on peaches and cider during a military campaign gone wrong. A ridiculous end, but fitting. Contemporary chroniclers did not mourn him. Matthew Paris, Roger of Wendover, and other monastic historians painted John as cruel, lecherous, and treacherous. Shakespeare later rendered him as weak and shrill. Victorian textbooks installed him as the bad king whose excesses made the good system possible. Every age weaponized John's memory for its own political sermons. But historians today have begun to pull apart the caricature. Not to redeem him, there is little to redeem, but to complicate the villainy. The argument goes something like this. John was a deeply flawed man handed a collapsing empire, surrounded by opportunistic elites, and locked into a system where charisma mattered more than competence. His failures were real, but so were the structural collapses around him. And maybe that's the true horror of King John, not that he was a monster, but that he didn't need to be. That ordinary mediocrity, combined with unchecked power and bitter insecurity, can wreck a kingdom just as easily as any grand evil. In the end, it's not the villainy that lingers, but the paperwork. Magna Carta. The name echoes through every courtroom, constitution, and civil rights movement that would follow. John's legacy isn't greatness or glory. It's a signature forced at sword point, proof that failure too can be immortal. But if John's reign was defined by forced signatures and unraveling empires, the next controversy comes not from weakness, but from suspicion. A usurper, a battlefield, 2 missing boys in a tower, and the shadow of a crown that never fit quite right. 2. King Richard III. History loves a body count, even when it can't quite prove one. When Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took the English throne in 1483, he did so under a sky already heavy with rumor. His brother, King Edward IV, was dead. Edward's 2 young sons, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, were alive technically, but inconveniently young. England had seen child kings before. It had not enjoyed them. So when Richard stepped forward as protector, many breathed a cautious sigh of relief. An experienced commander, a proven administrator, a man who, unlike the boy king, could actually keep the country from tearing itself apart. And then the boys disappeared. That's the moment Richard III stops being a man and becomes a question mark. At first, the transition of power followed legal choreography. Richard declared his nephews illegitimate, citing a pre-contract marriage allegedly made by Edward IV. Parliament backed the claim. The crown passed to Richard. Everything, on parchment at least, was lawful. But politics is never just parchment. It is optics, timing, and fear. And the optics were terrible. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother, were last seen in the summer of 1483. By autumn, silence. No public appearances, no explanations, no funerals, no bodies, just absence. And in politics, absence is rarely neutral. It fills itself with stories. Contemporaries whispered. Foreign courts speculated. Loyalists to the old Yorkist line grew uneasy. And Richard, instead of confronting the rumors head-on, did what would define his short reign. He governed competently, efficiently, and without charisma, as if good administration alone could outpace suspicion. It could not. Richard's defenders, then and now, point out what he actually did as king. He reformed the legal system. He promoted the use of English in court proceedings. He limited abuses of bail and improved access to justice for the poor. These are not the policies of a cartoon villain. They are the policies of a ruler who understood that legitimacy is built through fairness as much as force. But legitimacy also requires belief, and belief was slipping. The accusations hardened over time. First it was rumor, then it was assumption. Eventually it became narrative. The idea that Richard had ordered the deaths of his nephews, quietly, efficiently, without witnesses, slid into common understanding not because it was proven, but because it made the political chaos make sense. If the boys were alive, they would be rallying points. If they were dead, Richard's crown was stained, but secure. It was a grim logic. Medieval politics specialized in grim logic. What made Richard's position worse was not just the whispers, but the timing of his enemies. Henry Tudor, a man with a thin but usable claim to the throne, was watching from exile. He didn't need proof. He needed momentum. And Richard's reputation, increasingly brittle, provided it. The Battle of Bosworth in 1485 was not inevitable. It was opportunistic. Richard still had supporters. He still had an army. But he was ruling a country that wanted certainty more than justice. And Henry Tudor offered certainty wrapped in a promise. End the wars, marry into the Yorkist line, and close the book on bloodshed. Richard died on the battlefield, fighting personally, reportedly charging toward Henry Tudor in a last attempt to end the conflict in one decisive blow. It failed. His body was stripped, displayed, and buried without ceremony. The Tudor dynasty began the next morning, and then the story was rewritten. Under Tudor rule, Richard III transformed from a flawed ruler into a moral lesson. Chroniclers aligned with the new regime emphasized deformity, cruelty, ambition, and unnatural evil. His body became symbolic, twisted spine, twisted soul. Later, literature finished the job. Shakespeare's Richard is a snarling, self-aware villain who plots, murders, and delights in his own corruption. It is brilliant drama. It is also propaganda with poetic timing. Modern historians have spent centuries trying to peel Richard back out of that mask. Archaeology confirmed he had scoliosis, not monstrous deformities. Administrative records show reform, not chaos. And no document, no confession, no witness has ever conclusively proven he ordered the deaths of the princes in the Tower. But here's the uncomfortable part. Absence of proof is not proof of absence. And Richard's greatest failure may have been political, not criminal. He never solved the mystery that defined his reign. He let silence speak for him, and silence in a kingdom trained to fear ambition spoke loudly. So was Richard III a murderer? Possibly. Was he a usurper? Legally, less so than many kings before him. Was he a capable ruler? By evidence, yes. Was he doomed the moment those boys vanished? Almost certainly. That is why Richard III remains controversial, not because of what we know, but because of what we can't resolve. His reign sits at the intersection of law, rumor, and power. where morality is less important than perception. He is history's most famous maybe. A king undone not by tyranny, but by uncertainty. And that uncertainty would become a weapon. Because the next ruler on this list didn't inherit suspicion. He manufactured authority. He didn't disappear children. He disappeared wives. And in doing so, he didn't just reshape England's throne. He tore its religion apart and dared the entire continent to stop him. If you're still here after royal usurpation, missing princes, and Tudor spin machines, you're our kind of viewer. Don't forget to subscribe for more late-night dives into the messiest chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because nothing says healthy routine like medieval intrigue at 2 a.m. 3. King Henry VIII. Henry VIII did not begin his reign as a monster. That part matters, even if history rarely remembers it. In 1509, England crowned a handsome, athletic teenager with a sharp mind, a taste for music, and the kind of effortless confidence that makes courtiers believe everything is going to be fine. He wrote poetry. He debated theology. He dressed like a walking display of royal wealth. Compared to his cautious, suspicious father, Henry VII, this new king felt like a release of pressure. A golden age was expected. Applause came easily, and for a while, it worked. Henry VIII was charming in the way that only people born into absolute power can be charming, because nothing has ever truly pushed back against them yet. He enjoyed praise. He expected loyalty. He assumed outcomes would bend eventually, if he applied enough will. When things went wrong, his instinct was not self-reflection, but escalation. That instinct would become catastrophic. The controversy that defines Henry's life is often simplified to a single desire, a male heir. And yes, that obsession mattered. Dynasties had collapsed before. Civil war was not a theoretical fear, it was a recent memory. But reducing Henry VIII to a panicked father misses the deeper pattern. What Henry truly could not tolerate was constraint. Any institution, tradition, or person that said no eventually became an enemy. The first to learn this was the Church. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had lasted over 20 years. It was politically sound, diplomatically valuable, and emotionally exhausted. Catherine had produced a surviving daughter, Mary, but no living sons. Henry decided the marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. Conveniently, he also happened to be deeply interested in Anne Boleyn. The problem was that the Pope disagreed. In another timeline, this disagreement might have ended in resignation or compromise. In Henry's England, it ended in revolution. When Rome refused to annul the marriage, Henry didn't abandon Catholic belief so much as he rebranded it. The English Reformation was not born out of popular protest or grassroots theology. It was born out of royal frustration. Parliament was bent to Henry's will. Laws were passed. Oaths were demanded. And slowly, almost bureaucratically, the King of England became the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not just a religious shift. It was a power seizure of historic proportions. Monasteries were dissolved. Their lands were confiscated. Their wealth redistributed to loyal supporters. England's spiritual infrastructure was stripped and rebuilt under royal supervision. Some welcomed it. Others resisted quietly. A few resisted loudly, and paid for it with their careers, their freedom, or their lives. Henry did not enjoy cruelty for its own sake. That distinction matters. What he enjoyed was obedience. When obedience failed, punishment followed with chilling consistency. Former allies became traitors overnight. Silence became suspicious. Neutrality became dangerous. And then there were the marriages. 6 wives in 24 years has become a punchline, a mnemonic taught to children. But in Henry's time, each marriage was a political earthquake. Catherine of Aragon was cast aside, humiliated, and isolated. Anne Boleyn rose spectacularly and fell faster. Jane Seymour delivered the long-awaited son and died soon after, becoming immortalized precisely because she never lived long enough to disappoint him. The later marriages blurred together in exhaustion and damage control. Alliances misjudged. Affections cooled. The court learned a brutal lesson. Proximity to the king was both the highest honor and the greatest risk. Foreign observers watched England with fascination and alarm. Protestant reformers abroad were unsure whether Henry was an ally or a liability. Catholic powers viewed him as a dangerous precedent. Inside England, ordinary people struggled to keep up. 1 decade, loyalty to Rome was required. The next, it was treason. The rules kept changing, but the consequences stayed lethal. Modern historians argue endlessly about Henry's mind. Was he calculating or impulsive? Strategic or emotionally driven? The truth, inconveniently, appears to be both. He could plan meticulously, then unravel spectacularly when challenged. He trusted advisors, until he didn't. He delegated power, until it threatened him. As he aged, the contradictions sharpened. Injury, illness, and isolation narrowed his tolerance. The young king who once debated scholars became the older ruler who demanded affirmation. The state became an extension of his moods. Law followed desire. Fear replaced admiration. And yet, Henry VIII worked. That's the uncomfortable truth. He died in 1547 with a legitimate male heir, a transformed church, and a centralized monarchy stronger than any England had seen before. The price was staggering, but the outcome endured. This is why Henry VIII remains so controversial. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded using methods that still make people uneasy. He proved that a single ruler, armed with charisma and institutional leverage, could reshape religion, law, and culture within a single lifetime. England would spend the next century arguing with his shadow. Because once a king teaches a nation that rules can be rewritten, marriages annulled, and faith redefined by royal will alone, the question is no longer what he did, but who gets to decide next? And that question would come crashing down on the head of his eldest daughter, a queen remembered not for her doubts, but for her certainty, and for the name history gave her when certainty turned unforgiving. 4. Queen Mary they called her Bloody Mary. But not at first. When Mary Tudor became Queen of England in 1553, she walked into a realm that had been rewritten in her absence. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been cast aside. Her title, Princess, had been revoked. Her faith had been condemned as foreign superstition, and Mary herself had been half exiled, half watched, moving in and out of royal favor depending on the mood of her father and the instability of the English Reformation. But she survived. She endured the humiliations of her father's court, the reforms of her brother Edward's reign, and the very real possibility that she would die unmarried, childless, and forgotten, a relic of a Catholic dynasty England no longer wanted. Instead, she became queen. And from the moment she took the throne, everything became a referendum. On religion, on legitimacy, on vengeance, on legacy. The England Mary inherited was fractured. Her brother Edward VI, a devout Protestant, raised in the shadow of reformist zeal, had pushed England further from Rome than even Henry VIII had dared. Under Edward, traditional Catholic rites were stripped out, clerical marriage became normalized, and the Book of Common Prayer was enforced across parishes. Protestantism, though still fragile, had gained institutional footholds. Mary reversed all of it. Fast. She declared her legitimacy not just through bloodline but through faith. Her authority came from God, and that God was not interested in compromise. The Latin Mass returned. Papal authority was re-established. Clerical marriages were annulled. Protestant bishops were removed or imprisoned. The Tudor pendulum, which had swung back and forth for decades, now slammed hard into one direction, with little concern for who might be crushed underneath. Some called it justice. Others called it retribution. History would settle on a more damning label. The executions began in 1555. Protestant preachers, prominent reformers, and vocal critics were arrested, tried, and burned for heresy. The most famous among them, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, became martyrs in the Protestant imagination. The fires in Oxford and Smithfield weren't just literal. They ignited a memory war that would last for centuries. The total number of executions, somewhere around 280, was not, by European standards, unprecedented. But in England, where state-driven religious persecution had never been industrialized in this way, it felt new. Mary didn't invent religious punishment, but she gave it a brand. And in a world increasingly defined by printed pamphlets, Protestant exiles made sure that brand stuck. Hence, Bloody Mary. To her supporters, the burnings were necessary. A cleansing of heresy, a restoration of spiritual order. To her enemies, they were confirmation that Catholicism and cruelty walked hand in hand. The irony, of course, was that Mary genuinely believed she was saving souls. The executions weren't bloodlust, they were doctrine. Mercy through fire. That theological rationale didn't help her reputation, especially once Protestantism returned under her successor and rewrote the narrative. But religious persecution wasn't Mary's only controversy. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, heir to the vast Habsburg Empire, caused widespread political panic. Parliament and the public feared that England would become a satellite of Spanish ambition. Philip, cold and politically calculating, made little effort to endear himself. Though the marriage contract included clauses to prevent foreign control, few believed them. When Mary's phantom pregnancies, likely psychosomatic or symptoms of a medical condition, failed to produce an heir, the political implications became existential. Without a Catholic successor, Mary's work would be undone, and waiting in the wings was her half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant with sharp instincts and growing public support. The irony here is bitter. Mary, who had fought so hard to secure her mother's legacy and her own right to rule, now faced the same dilemma her father had used to justify his break from Rome. No male heir, no clear succession, no certainty. And in the middle of this was Calais. In 1558, England lost Calais, the last English possession in mainland France. It was more symbolic than strategic by that point, but for a queen trying to defend her legitimacy, it was a devastating blow. Calais had been held by England for over 2 centuries. Losing it felt like losing a piece of the medieval crown itself. Mary reportedly said that when she died, they would find Calais written on her heart. Whether she actually said it is unclear. But the loss became part of her epitaph anyway. Mary died later that year, sick, politically isolated, and aware that her throne would pass to the very woman whose religious policies she had tried to prevent. Elizabeth would inherit the crown and the narrative. The legacy of Mary was not written by her supporters. It was written by her enemies. Protestant historians like John Foxe canonized the martyrs, framed Mary as a tyrant, and immortalized the Marian burnings as a national trauma. Shakespeare's generation would ignore her almost entirely. Later Victorians would invoke her as a cautionary tale. Her image, a solemn woman with haunted eyes, became a symbol of everything English history wanted to forget. Religious violence, foreign influence, female authority gone wrong. But modern historians have tried to reframe her. They point out that Mary's persecution mirrored patterns across Europe, that her marriage was politically rational, if emotionally ill-fated, that she was the first woman to rule England in her own right, a constitutional innovation often overlooked, that her Catholic reforms were not simply reactionary, but deeply rooted in popular tradition, especially in rural areas where Protestantism had not yet fully taken hold. They stress that Bloody Mary is a slogan, not a biography. Still, the core tension remains. Was Mary a failed reformer or a principled monarch caught in history's whiplash? A persecutor or a savior of souls? A tragic figure or a cautionary one? What's clear is that she reigned in a moment of profound instability and chose certainty over compromise. That choice made her powerful. It also made her feared. And fear, once institutionalized, never leaves quietly. Because the story of English monarchy isn't just about who holds the crown. It's about who survives the chaos that follows. And in the next chapter, survival will take center stage. Because not all kings fall in battle. Some fall on the inside, undone by loyalty turned sour, banners turned inward, and a battlefield where the only victory is living long enough to be overthrown by your wife. 5. King Edward II. Imagine being born to one of England's greatest warrior kings, and growing up to be everything he wasn't. Edward II, son of Edward I, stepped into a crown forged by conquest. His father had earned the name Hammer of the Scots, ruled with flinty discipline, and expanded the English monarchy's reach through sheer force and fear. The Plantagenet state was at its peak, disciplined, aggressive, and hungry. Then came Edward II, gentle, artistic, trusting, emotionally dependent, and as the chronicles will never stop reminding us, utterly uninterested in continuing the family brand of iron-fisted kingship. From the very beginning, Edward II seemed off-script. He preferred manual labor to military strategy. He reportedly enjoyed ditch-digging, woodworking, and hanging out with commoners. These aren't flaws, obviously, but in a medieval monarchy obsessed with symbolism, optics, and authority, they didn't help. Kings were supposed to dominate councils, terrorize enemies, and project a sacred distance from the people they ruled. Edward preferred barge rides and rustic escapes. The court gossiped. Chroniclers snickered. Nobles grew nervous. But the real political earthquake came in the form of Piers Gaveston. Gaveston wasn't just a close friend, he was an obsession. Edward elevated him beyond reason, showering him with titles, lands, and access to power that enraged the nobility. Whether or not the relationship was romantic or intimate in the way modern minds assume is beside the point. What mattered was the favoritism. Gaveston, seen as arrogant and mocking, flaunted his access, and Edward made little effort to hide the centrality of their bond. This wasn't just unpopular, it was destabilizing. In 1308, barely a year into Edward's reign, the barons forced Gaveston into exile. Edward brought him back. They forced him out again. He returned again. Eventually, the situation became untenable. The barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster and others, captured and executed Gaveston in 1312, without trial, without apology. It was a blunt message. Loyalty to the crown had limits, and Edward had reached them. The king was devastated. But he did not, as some expected, reform. Instead, he found new favorites. This time it was Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father. The Despensers were more strategic than Gaveston and far more ruthless. Edward leaned on them completely, ceding political judgment, military direction, and increasingly, national trust. The result was a second act of favoritism, corruption, and revenge politics. The Despensers enriched themselves through legal manipulation and property seizures, provoking widespread rebellion from nobles who once again felt bypassed and insulted. And then came Bannockburn. In 1314, Edward led an army into Scotland to reclaim control from Robert the Bruce. It was supposed to be a show of Plantagenet dominance. Instead, it became one of the most infamous military defeats in English history. The English forces were shattered. The myth of invincible monarchy, already fraying under Edward's strange leadership, collapsed. The defeat wasn't just about losing to the Scots. It was about exposure. Edward's inability to command the field confirmed what many nobles had long feared, that he lacked the basic tools of kingship. In a feudal world, where martial prowess defined masculine and political legitimacy, this loss wasn't just embarrassing. It was regime-shaking. By the early 1320s, England was a powder keg. The baronial opposition tried to force reform. Edward, empowered by the Despensers, and what remained of his loyal court, resisted. Civil war erupted. Lancaster was defeated and executed in 1322, but the resentment didn't die with him. It smoldered, quietly, in private letters, in secret alliances, and most dangerously, in the Queen's own heart. Isabella of France, Edward's wife, was no passive observer. She had been married off as a child in the usual transactional dynastic fashion, daughter of the French king, bride to the English crown. For years she tolerated Edward's favoritisms, endured her reduced role, and maneuvered within the narrow corridors of royal influence available to a woman in her position. But by the mid-1320s, she had had enough. What followed was one of the most dramatic and still debated episodes in English royal history. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France to negotiate with her brother, now King Charles IV, over a tense political standoff. She used the opportunity to stay, and then to rebel. She aligned herself with Roger Mortimer, a powerful noble who had escaped imprisonment in the Tower of London and fled to France. The nature of their relationship, like so many in this period, is colored by rumor, partisan commentary, and centuries of projection. What is clear is this: they formed a political alliance, raised support, and planned an invasion. In 1326, they landed in England with a relatively small force, but they didn't need numbers. They had something more powerful: popular support. Edward, abandoned by many of his nobles and even some of his own troops, fled. The Despensers were captured, tried, and executed. The regime unraveled in a matter of weeks. By early 1327, Edward II had been forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. It was the first time in English history that a reigning monarch had been formally removed from power by internal rebellion. Parliament, manipulated but present, gave the move legal shape. But the real shift had already happened. Monarchy, once seen as divinely untouchable, had proven breakable. Edward was imprisoned, isolated, and gradually erased from public life. Officially, he died in September of 1327. The circumstances of his death remain murky. Rumors, some sensational and lurid, circulated almost immediately. Chroniclers speculated about methods, motives, and secrecy. Modern historians remain divided. Was he murdered? Did he die of illness? Was he quietly kept alive in obscurity? None of it can be confirmed, and all of it adds to the myth. What's clear is this: Edward II's reign broke nearly every rule of medieval kingship. He was not brave in battle. He was not decisive in politics. He was emotionally vulnerable, dependent on companions, and seemingly indifferent to the expectations of image. But for all his flaws, and they were numerous, his story is not a simple morality tale. He was a king trying to rule in a system that demanded performance over authenticity. He chose loyalty to individuals over appeasement to factions. He mistook intimacy for strategy, and he failed to understand that power, once cracked, shatters fast. Modern historians have attempted to reevaluate Edward II with more nuance. Some stress that the state was already fraying under structural pressure: financial exhaustion, long wars, noble competition. Others explore the gendered and emotional expectations of medieval kingship and how Edward's personality defied them. A few even question the traditional timeline of his death, citing obscure sources that hint at a life in exile. But regardless of these debates, Edward's reign remains a rupture point. The idea that a king could be overthrown by his wife and a runaway noble, with Parliament as a legal fig leaf, sent shockwaves through the English monarchy. It revealed just how thin the line was between divine right and political reality, and the fallout didn't stop there. 6. King Henry II. If there is a patron saint of royal overcommitment, it might be Henry II. He ruled more land than any English monarch before him, tried to tame a lawless nobility, rewrote the rules of kingship, and then tripped over his own throne, largely because he thought he could out-argue the church. This was a king whose control issues weren't just psychological, they were geopolitical. And at the center of it all stood a single figure who would become both his closest friend and most dangerous enemy, Thomas Becket. Henry wasn't born to rule England alone. His empire, the so-called Angevin Empire, stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. By his mid-20s, he held England, Normandy, Anjou, and through marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, most of southwestern France. A logistical nightmare for anyone, but Henry, he saw it as a legal project. To Henry, governance was a puzzle to be solved with rules, precedent, and efficiency. People, unfortunately, were messier. His reign began in 1154, a deliberate act of cleanup after the disaster of King Stephen's rule, which had left England riddled with feuding barons, lawless strongholds, and something historians politely call widespread disorder, and less politely call Civil War cosplay with real swords. Henry swept in like an exasperated landlord with a clipboard. He demolished illegal castles, strengthened royal courts, and expanded the use of itinerant judges, which made him, in some circles, a hero of English common law. His reforms were efficient, modern, and, crucially, centralized. Everything revolved around the king, a problem if your subjects were ambitious nobles, a disaster if one of them was the church. Enter Thomas Becket. Becket and Henry were close, not just politically but personally. As Chancellor, Becket had been Henry's right-hand man, savvy, sharp, and just as obsessed with royal authority. So when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry saw an opportunity. Make Becket the new archbishop, and suddenly the church, long an independent power within England, would be aligned with the crown. Or so he thought. Becket, however, performed the greatest spiritual plot twist of the 12th century. The moment he became archbishop, he shed his courtly skin. He resigned as chancellor. He embraced his religious role with theatrical devotion. He started challenging royal policies, especially those that infringed on ecclesiastical privilege. Henry was stunned. He hadn't appointed a bishop. He'd created a moral rival. The flashpoint came in 1164 with the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of legal reforms designed to limit ecclesiastical autonomy. Essentially, Henry wanted clerics who committed crimes to be tried in royal courts rather than church ones. Becket refused. A series of escalating confrontations followed: excommunications, public quarrels, and political posturing that culminated in Becket fleeing to France for several years. By the time he returned in 1170, things had gone from bad to biblical. What happened next is famous, not for clarity, but for consequence. Henry, frustrated by Becket's defiance, reportedly exploded in anger. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The words were likely rhetorical. The results were not. 4 knights took the statement literally. They traveled to Canterbury and killed Becket at the altar of his own cathedral. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Becket became a martyr. Miracles were reported at his tomb. The church turned him into a symbol of resistance against royal overreach. And Henry, the great systemizer, the legalist king, was suddenly cast as a blasphemous tyrant. It's hard to walk back being accused of indirectly triggering the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry did what any monarch caught in a medieval PR crisis might do: public penance. He walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury. He allowed himself to be scourged by monks. He wept publicly at Becket's tomb. It wasn't just damage control. It was a survival strategy. He knew that unless he performed contrition on the grandest stage possible, the spiritual fallout could shatter his reign. And yet, he survived. Politically, at least. The church extracted its concessions. The barons, somewhat pacified, remained in check. But the Becket affair left a scar on his reign and cast a long theological shadow over English monarchy. It created a cautionary tale. Even the strongest king can be undone by a single altar. But that wasn't Henry's only source of controversy. His greatest enemies weren't just in cathedrals. They were in his own home. Henry had 4 sons. And like any man who designed systems for a living, he thought succession could be planned, divided, managed. He was wrong. He named his eldest son, also Henry, just to keep everyone confused, as junior king while he still lived. But he didn't give him real power, just the title. The younger Henry rebelled, so did his brothers, Richard, later the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John. Yes, that John. The wars between father and sons were brutal. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's queen and former duchess in her own right, even sided with her sons. She was eventually imprisoned by Henry for over a decade. It was a family that could have inspired Shakespeare, and later did. Henry's final years were marked by exhaustion, betrayal, and loss. His sons continued to plot against him. His health declined. He died in 1189, outmaneuvered and alone, betrayed by his favorite son, John, and defeated by Richard, who would go on to become king. So, how do historians judge him? Modern assessments are complex. On one hand, Henry II was a foundational monarch. His legal reforms shaped English governance for centuries. His court attracted intellectuals. He brought order to a kingdom that had almost unraveled. But his flaws were fatal. He believed in logic over loyalty, structure over sentiment. He alienated allies, underestimated enemies, and tried to out-negotiate the divine. The Becket affair remains the most infamous moment of his reign, not just because of the murder, but because of what it revealed. That even kings cannot always control the forces they try to harness. That friendship twisted into rivalry is the most dangerous kind. That reform, without humility, can backfire into martyrdom. In the centuries since, Henry has been portrayed in every possible light. The tragic patriarch, the ruthless tyrant, the misunderstood reformer. And perhaps he was all of them. But one image endures more than most. The architect king, standing in the ruins of his own moral ambition, undone not by war or fate, but by words he may not even have meant. And as we leave the courtroom intrigues of the 12th century, the story doesn't get any gentler. Because the next royal on our list, a queen, will take up the very weapon that Henry's world could not contain, open rebellion, against a king, with a lover, in a cloak and dagger coup that changed the meaning of monarchy and made history flinch. 7. Queen Isabella of France. If you were writing a medieval thriller and needed a morally ambiguous queen, you'd invent someone like Isabella of France. But the thing is, you wouldn't have to. She already existed, daughter of the King of France, wife to one of England's most troubled kings, and the orchestrator of a coup that turned marital dysfunction into national transformation. Isabella's life was so tangled in politics, betrayal, and rumor that the line between legend and fact has been blurry for over 700 years. And to this day, historians still argue, was she a power-hungry traitor? A proto-feminist queen resisting tyranny? Or just someone trying to survive a royal marriage that had already collapsed from within? Let's start with the marriage, the fuse to everything else. Isabella married Edward II of England in 1308 when she was about 12 years old. Political alliance first, emotional bond maybe later. But it didn't take long for things to go wrong. Edward, son of the formidable Edward I, had inherited a kingdom filled with expectations for martial strength, noble order, and dynastic stability. Unfortunately, what England got instead was a king more interested in his personal favorites than in ruling. Those favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, became flashpoints of national unrest. They wielded disproportionate influence, enraged the barons, and were widely seen as undermining the proper order of governance. And Isabella? She was sidelined, publicly humiliated, stripped of lands and influence while her husband poured power into the hands of men who provoked nearly every noble in the kingdom. For a while, Isabella played the part. She bore children. She attended court. She stayed silent. But that silence broke in 1325. Edward, facing political problems with France, sent Isabella there to negotiate. But she refused to return. Instead, she made an alliance with an exiled nobleman, Roger Mortimer. Together they raised an army, sailed back to England, and launched what was effectively a bloodless coup. Edward II was captured. His favorites were eliminated, and Isabella, for the first time in her life, was at the center of power, as regent for her young son, Edward III. Now pause for a moment. A queen consort had just overthrown a reigning king, her husband, and installed her son in his place. This wasn't just palace intrigue. It was an open challenge to the divine order that monarchy was supposed to represent. It shook the idea that kings were unchallengeable, and it created a model for deposition that future rebels would study very carefully. But power, as ever, came with backlash. Isabella and Mortimer ruled England from 1327 to 1330, and their governance quickly drew criticism. Mortimer was seen as grasping and authoritarian. Isabella as overreaching and improperly intimate with him. Chroniclers labeled her the she-wolf of France, a phrase that drips with gendered venom. Even today, it sticks. And in 1330, the backlash arrived. Her son, Edward III, now 18, staged his own coup. Mortimer was arrested and executed. Isabella was placed under house arrest, not imprisoned, but removed from power. She lived out the rest of her days in relative comfort, out of politics, and under historical suspicion. Modern historians take a more balanced view. They note that Isabella's rebellion had elite support, that her husband's misrule was widely condemned, that her political actions were daring, yes, but not unprecedented, and certainly not the wild betrayal some chroniclers painted. The she-wolf label, while evocative, says more about medieval discomfort with powerful women than it does about her actual policies. Still, the controversy remains. How do you judge a queen who overthrew a king, who acted when others wouldn't, but also benefited personally from the fall? Who survived an impossible position only to become a cautionary tale? Isabella was many things: strategist, survivor, scandal, but perhaps most of all, she was a mirror, reflecting the chaos of a monarchy stretched to its limits, where love, power, and politics were always at odds. And the lesson? Sometimes the most dangerous figures in royal history aren't the ones who inherit the throne. They're the ones who decide to take it. Which brings us to a different kind of royal collapse. Not one born of family drama, but of ideology, absolutism, and a war that tore the kingdom in two. The next king would not just lose his crown, he'd lose the illusion that monarchy itself was untouchable. 8. King Charles V. Some monarchs are remembered for glory, others for failure. And then there's King Charles I, remembered for losing his head, literally and metaphorically. His reign didn't just end in controversy. It ended in civil war, courtroom spectacle, and a public execution that shattered the divine mystique of English monarchy. Before Charles, the idea of removing a king was whispered in corners. After Charles, it was precedent. It's easy to paint him as a tragic figure, a man out of step with his time, too dignified to survive the chaos he helped create. But the fuller picture is less poetic, more combustible. A ruler whose stubbornness, secrecy, and belief in absolute authority collided head-on with an England increasingly allergic to being ruled from above. Charles I came to the throne in 1625, the second son of James I. His older brother, Henry, had been the heir, bright, popular, martial. Charles was quieter, more introverted, and deeply religious, where Henry was charismatic. Charles was precise. Where James could navigate the politics of compromise, Charles preferred a divine mandate. That divine mandate would define his kingship and ultimately destroy it. From the outset, Charles believed that kings were chosen by God, that their authority was sacred, not symbolic, not constitutional, actual, active, God-given power. He didn't think he needed Parliament's permission to govern, only their cooperation. and when they didn't cooperate, he simply did without them. This belief led to what's often called the personal rule, an 11-year stretch from 1629 to 1640 in which Charles governed without Parliament entirely. Instead, he relied on outdated taxes, fines, and creative fiscal schemes to fund the government. These workarounds, like the infamous ship money tax, weren't just unpopular. They were legally questionable. Many saw them as proof that Charles didn't just misunderstand consent, he ignored it. Religion made things worse. Charles, a high Anglican with Catholic-leaning aesthetics, pushed for uniformity in worship. His Archbishop, William Laud, enforced ceremonial practices that many Protestants found suspiciously Roman. Puritans saw it as backsliding into popery. Scots, fiercely Presbyterian, outright rejected it. When Charles tried to impose a new prayer book in Scotland in 1637, riots erupted. Those riots turned into rebellion. Rebellion meant war, and war meant money, which meant, reluctantly, inevitably, calling Parliament back. But by then, Parliament didn't just want funding. They wanted change. The next decade was a whirlwind of escalation. Parliament passed laws to limit royal power. Charles pushed back. Factions formed. Trust eroded. In 1642, Charles entered the House of Commons with armed guards, attempting to arrest 5 MPs, a move seen as tyrannical. Within months, England descended into civil war. The wars themselves, and there were several, tore the country apart. Families were divided, towns changed hands, institutions crumbled. On one side stood the Royalists, Cavaliers, loyal to Charles. On the other, the Parliamentarians, Roundheads, led by figures like Oliver Cromwell. What began as a political crisis became a military one, and ultimately a moral one. By 1646, Charles had lost. But instead of negotiating peace, he played a game of royal brinkmanship, attempting to leverage Scottish support, stalling talks, and igniting a second war. This shattered what little trust remained. Parliament, now controlled by hardliners, reached a grim conclusion. As long as Charles lived, there could be no peace. In 1649, Charles was put on trial for treason, not against a person, but against the people. The trial was theater and revolution all at once. No English king had ever been held legally accountable by his own subjects. Charles refused to recognize the court, declaring that no earthly power could judge a king. But the court moved forward anyway. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was executed on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in London. His death was clean, public, and irreversible. For a moment, monarchy itself was abolished. England became a republic, the Commonwealth, ruled by Parliament and Cromwell's army. But that experiment would collapse within a decade. In 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, Charles I's son. The old order came back, but it never forgot the crack. So what do we make of Charles I? He wasn't evil. He wasn't incompetent in the traditional sense, but he was disastrously inflexible. His belief in divine right blinded him to political reality. He couldn't bend, so his reign broke. To his supporters, he became a martyr, a sainted king who died for the sacred principle of monarchy. The Church of England still honors him with a feast day. To his critics, he was the architect of his own downfall, a man who misunderstood his people so profoundly that he brought a country to civil war. Modern historians are more nuanced. They acknowledge the structural pressures, the religious tensions, the financial problems, the constitutional confusion. But they also point to Charles's decisions, deliberate, repeated, and risky. The man might have meant well, but the king? The king miscalculated nearly everything. And so, England learned, in blood and spectacle, that royalty wasn't beyond accountability. That kings could lose not just battles, but their very legitimacy. But the monarchy wasn't done collapsing. because less than 50 years later, another king, also named James, also obsessed with power and religion, would be removed too. Only this time the revolution wouldn't come with swords and scaffolds. It would come with an invitation. 9. King James II, 7th of Scotland. If Charles III was the king who lost his head, James II was the king who lost his timing. In an age haunted by civil war and allergic to the scent of absolutism, James walked into his reign with a match in one hand and a prayer book in the other, and then seemed genuinely surprised when the house caught fire. Where his father had been executed, James would be exiled, not through rebellion, not through bloodshed, but through an almost polite revolution. It was, by most definitions, the least violent deposition in English history, but the controversy it created has lasted for centuries. James was the younger brother of Charles II and the second son of Charles I, which meant he spent most of his formative years in European exile, watching his family fall apart and learning what not to do. Unfortunately, what he learned wasn't what England wanted. He returned to favor after the Restoration in 1660 and quickly rose to prominence in his brother's court. But from the beginning, there was a problem: religion. James had quietly converted to Catholicism sometime in the 1660s, a personal choice that became a political liability in a country still scarred by religious conflict. Officially, England was Protestant. Culturally, it was even more Protestant, and while Charles II was willing to play both sides, keeping his own Catholic sympathies cloaked in plausible deniability, James was less subtle. By the time Charles died in 1685, James was openly Catholic and immediately crowned king. At first, many hoped for stability. After all, James was a seasoned military commander, an experienced administrator, and, at least in theory, a man who had learned restraint from his family's previous disasters. But what followed was a rapid spiral into suspicion and political crisis. The controversy wasn't just that James was Catholic. It was that he governed like a man trying to turn the clock back, to before Parliament, before Protestant dominance, before limited monarchy. He issued a series of declarations of indulgence, aiming to grant religious freedom to Catholics and Protestant dissenters. In principle, this sounded enlightened. In practice, it was seen as royal overreach, especially since he bypassed Parliament to do it. Then came the personnel changes. James filled key military, academic, and administrative roles with Catholics, including some with little experience and many with open hostility toward the Anglican establishment. The army, the universities, the judiciary, all saw royal interventions that felt less like reform and more like infiltration. Parliament was alarmed. The church was offended. The nobles were restless. But the real tipping point came in 1688 with the birth of a baby boy. Until then, many had tolerated James in the hope that he would be a temporary glitch, a one-generation problem. His Protestant daughter Mary, married to the staunchly Protestant William of Orange, was next in line. But the arrival of a male Catholic heir, James Francis Edward, changed the succession. Now, it wasn't just a Catholic king. It was the prospect of a Catholic dynasty. The reaction was swift. 7 leading nobles, from both Tory and Whig factions, secretly invited William of Orange to invade England, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. William landed in November 1688. As his forces approached, James lost support almost immediately. Nobles defected. Officers deserted. Even his daughter Anne joined the opposition. Faced with collapse, James panicked. First, he sent his wife and son to France. Then he tried to flee himself, tossing the royal seal into the Thames for dramatic effect. He was captured, then released, then fled again. This time successfully. He would never return as king. What followed became known as the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because it was relatively bloodless, Revolution because it permanently changed the monarchy. Parliament declared that James had effectively abdicated. In his place, they offered the throne jointly to William and Mary, with a new set of conditions, the English Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, 1689, wasn't just a legal document. It was a constitutional reboot. It limited royal power, guaranteed certain civil liberties, and made it explicitly illegal for a Catholic to ascend the throne. It ended any pretense of divine right monarchy and ushered in the era of constitutional monarchy, one where kings and queens ruled with, not above, Parliament. So what became of James? He spent the rest of his life in France, at the court of his cousin Louis XIV, occasionally plotting a return that never came. He died in 1701, a king without a crown, remembered more for what he represented than what he accomplished. Modern historians debate the usual themes. Was James trying to promote tolerance, or simply to re-Catholicize England? Was he naive or just politically tone-deaf? Was his fall inevitable, or the result of a well-coordinated coup masquerading as a constitutional rescue? Either way, his reign became the case study in how not to lead in a post-Civil War England. He wasn't overthrown because he was Catholic. He was overthrown because he refused to accept that being king was no longer the same thing as being in charge. The monarchy would never be the same again. The crown remained, but its authority was now held on loan, renewable by Parliament, contingent on behavior, and always under public scrutiny. And as the royal line moved forward, its next controversial figure would wear the title of conqueror. But behind the myth of noble invasion was a blueprint for control so ruthless that it still echoes in land, language, and law. 10. King William I, the Conqueror. Before there were Tudors, before there were Plantagenets, there was a man with a boat, a banner, and a claim, and just enough divine confidence to believe England might belong to him. William I of England, better known to history as the Conqueror, didn't just take the throne. He seized the narrative. His controversy wasn't a scandal or a court intrigue. It was existential. William didn't inherit England, he invaded it. He didn't plead legitimacy. He burned it into submission. He didn't adjust to the country. He reprogrammed it. And 1,000 years later, we still can't quite agree whether he saved the kingdom or destroyed it. Born around 1028 in Falaise, Normandy, William was illegitimate, a fact that shaped both his psyche and his reputation. He was called William the Bastard before he ever picked up a sword. But illegitimacy didn't bar him from ambition. Raised in a violent and chaotic duchy, William learned early that power was not inherited gently. It was clawed, defended, and enforced with the kind of strategic cruelty that only warlords turned kings seem to fully master. By the time Edward the Confessor, King of England, died in 1066, William had consolidated his power in Normandy and built a case, equal parts claim and charisma, that he was the rightful heir to the English throne. His argument was that Edward had promised him the crown years before, and just to reinforce that claim, William insisted that Harold Godwinson, Edward's powerful Anglo-Saxon noble and successor, had sworn an oath to support William's right. When Harold took the throne instead, William treated it not as politics, but betrayal. And so he sailed. The Norman invasion of 1066 wasn't just military. It was theatrical. William landed on England's shores with papal blessing, a banner from Rome, and a confidence that bordered on prophecy. On October 14th, at the Battle of Hastings, Harold was killed, under circumstances that would become a blend of fact and myth. And William seized the moment. But conquest is never the end of a war. It's the beginning of occupation. When William was crowned king on Christmas Day in Westminster Abbey 1066, he wasn't greeted as a liberator. He was feared, mistrusted, and resented. His first years as king were spent not celebrating victory, but putting out fires, literal and metaphorical. The English elite did not accept him. The North rebelled. So did the Welsh borders. So did various local lords who found themselves pushed out of ancestral holdings by new Norman upstarts. William responded with brutal precision. His most infamous campaign came in 1069–70, when northern uprisings forced his hand. The harrying of the North, as it became known, wasn't a traditional military engagement. It was a scorched earth operation. Crops were destroyed, villages were burned, livestock slaughtered. Thousands died, not in battle, but from starvation and exposure in the brutal winters that followed. Contemporary chroniclers condemned it as excessive. Modern historians still debate the numbers, the motives, and the ethical frame. Was it ethnic cleansing, strategic terror, necessary suppression? No matter how it's parsed, the result was clear. Resistance collapsed. The North was pacified, and William had sent a message. Rebellion would not be tolerated. And yet, even as he ruled with an iron fist, William didn't simply impose Norman culture on England. He transformed its foundations. He brought with him the feudal system as practiced in northern France, replacing the loosely federated Anglo-Saxon nobility with a strict, centralized pyramid of loyalty. Lands were confiscated and redistributed to his Norman followers. The Domesday Book, commissioned in 1085, became the most comprehensive survey of land, people, and property in medieval Europe. It wasn't just an inventory. It was control rendered in ink. By 1086, almost every major landholder in England owed their allegiance directly to William. It was one of the most aggressive systematic re-engineerings of a nation's aristocracy in history. The Anglo-Saxon elite were almost entirely wiped from power, socially, politically, and culturally. The English language itself began to bend. Norman French became the language of court, law, and high society. English survived, but it was pushed underground, reserved for peasants, clergy, and the unimportant. Over centuries, the two languages would merge, birthing modern English. But at the time, it was a cultural decapitation. William's reign in many ways invented medieval England. But invention comes at a cost. To those who benefited from the conquest, Norman nobles, churchmen who found promotion under William's reforms, military allies rewarded with estates, he was a stabilizer, a reformer, a builder of kingdoms. To the dispossessed Anglo-Saxon elite, he was a foreign tyrant who ripped out the roots of English tradition. And to the common people, whose lives were measured in rent, taxes, and oaths, William was less a man than a system, remote, relentless, and largely indifferent to their suffering. Religiously, William walked a careful line. He remained devoutly Christian but refused to cede royal authority to the Church. While he respected the Pope, he made it clear that papal decisions in England required royal assent. He appointed bishops, reorganized ecclesiastical structures, and expanded Norman-style Romanesque church architecture across the kingdom. But even his ecclesiastical appointments served his consolidation of power. The church became another arm of royal control. Spiritual, yes, but deeply political. And then there's the matter of legitimacy. William's claim to the English throne was always debated, even in his own lifetime. His justification hinged on a verbal promise from Edward the Confessor and a coerced oath from Harold. But the English nobility had never formally agreed to his succession. He didn't win the crown through inheritance or parliament. He won it through battle, and in doing so, he set a precedent that would echo through English history. Might makes monarchy. Every civil war, every usurpation, every disputed succession in the centuries to come would exist, in part, in William's shadow. He had proven that a king didn't have to be accepted, only victorious. He died in 1087, after a campaign in northern France, from injuries sustained in battle, a somewhat mundane end for a man whose life reshaped a nation. His body, swollen and unattended, was eventually buried in Caen. His tomb would later be desecrated during the French Wars of Religion, his bones scattered. The remains that were reburied under a marble slab in the 17th century might or might not even be his. A fittingly ambiguous end to a king who never truly belonged to one place. Modern historians remain divided on William. Was he a tyrant? A reformer? A pragmatic strategist who understood the brutality of his age? Or a self-righteous conqueror who cloaked ambition in divine approval? The Domesday Book still survives. So do the castles he built. Motte and Bailey fortresses designed to dominate the landscape. So does the genetic footprint of his Norman nobility and the bloodlines of Europe's elite. But more than that, William's true legacy is cultural. He made England a fusion state, not Anglo-Saxon, not French, but something in between. And in doing so, he created a kingdom that would forever struggle with questions of identity, legitimacy, and power. His conquest was total, but his acceptance was never complete. Because in every medieval rebellion, every noble grudge, every baronial revolt that followed, there was a whisper underneath it all. Who really gets to wear the crown? The one with the clearest bloodline? The one with God's blessing? Or the one who wins the fight? William answered that question brutally, and England never forgot. But the next monarch wouldn't arrive with a sword or papal banner. He would inherit a broken kingdom, besieged by foreign raids, internal instability, and the slow suffocation of confidence in his rule. He would not be called the Conqueror. He would be called something else entirely, something that, in its own way, might be even more damning. 11. King Ethelred II, the Unready, nickname itself controversial. It says a lot when your reign is remembered more for what fell apart than what you tried to hold together. And it says even more when your nickname becomes a national diagnosis. Ethelred II of England, crowned as a child in 978 AD, ruled for nearly 4 decades in one of the most unstable and humiliating chapters in English history. He has been called weak, incompetent, indecisive. His nickname, the Unready, has been quoted, mocked, and weaponized by centuries of historians, chroniclers, and schoolchildren alike. But the controversy surrounding Ethelred is less about one king's mistakes and more about the limits of power in the face of overwhelming crisis, the kind that doesn't knock politely but crashes ashore with long ships and fire. Because Ethelred's England didn't collapse overnight. It was invaded, again and again. And the real question is whether Ethelred failed his kingdom, or whether the kingdom was already failing long before he inherited it. To understand Ethelred's rise, you first have to understand his blood-soaked beginning. He became king at just around 10 years old, following the suspicious murder of his older half-brother, King Edward the Martyr. The details remain murky, but the politics were clear. Ethelred's mother, Elfthryth, likely had a role in orchestrating Edward's death, or at least benefiting from it. The young king's reign began not with coronation hymns, but with whispers of fratricide. That shadow would never fully leave him. He inherited a kingdom that had seen both glory and fragility. His predecessors, particularly King Edgar and King Alfred before him, had forged a sense of English unity from the patchwork of older Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The system of shires, the legal codes, the fledgling bureaucracy, all of it was still standing. But underneath, there were cracks. Local loyalties ran deeper than national identity. Powerful earls could rival the king in authority. And looming over it all, from across the North Sea, came a threat that had once been beaten back, but never erased. The Vikings were returning. Raids had been intermittent in the decades before Ethelred's rule. But in the late 10th century, they intensified. No longer just opportunistic plundering parties. These Viking attacks became coordinated, sustained, and increasingly political. Danish warlords saw England not just as a source of silver, but as a viable target for conquest. And England, under Ethelred, proved disturbingly easy to exploit. In response to the raids, Ethelred did what any rational medieval ruler would do. He paid them to stop. The so-called Danegeld, a protection payment made to Viking forces, became one of Ethelred's signature policies. In 991, after a particularly devastating defeat at the Battle of Maldon, The king authorized a payment of 10,000 pounds of silver to the Vikings in exchange for peace. It worked, temporarily. But when more attacks followed, he paid again, and again. Over the course of his reign, these payments increased, both in frequency and in volume, reaching tens of thousands of pounds. Critics would later interpret this as cowardice or incompetence, a king trying to bribe his way out of leadership. But the truth is murkier. The Danegeld was not unique to Ethelred. Earlier rulers had also negotiated with Viking leaders. Even Alfred the Great, the celebrated warrior king, had entered into treaties with Norse warlords. The problem wasn't the idea of paying. It was the growing realization that Ethelred had no credible military strategy to back it up. The payments weren't part of a coordinated policy. They were acts of desperation, and the Vikings could smell it. As the invasions escalated, Ethelred's government responded by centralizing its administrative functions, raising taxes, reforming currency, and attempting to standardize military obligations. On paper, this was efficient. In practice, it strained local loyalties. Some regions, like the Danelaw, the former Viking-controlled zone in the north and east of England, remained culturally and politically ambivalent about the idea of resisting Scandinavian rule. In other areas, earls acted independently, pursuing their own regional interests. And Ethelred? He sat at the center of it all, issuing decrees, reshuffling advisors, and increasingly relying on a tight-knit inner circle who were often viewed as corrupt or ineffective. One of the most infamous episodes of Ethelred's reign, and one of the most morally controversial, was the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002. Convinced that the Danes living in England were plotting against him, Ethelred ordered their coordinated killing on November 13th of that year. The actual scale of the violence is debated by historians, but the fallout was significant. Among those reportedly killed was Gunhilda, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. This was not just a massacre. It was a declaration of war. Sweyn invaded in retaliation, launching a campaign that would destabilize England for the next decade. In 1013, he conquered the kingdom outright, forcing Ethelred into exile in Normandy. For a brief moment, it looked as if the House of Wessex was finished, but then Sweyn died unexpectedly in 1014. Ethelred returned, on condition that he rule better than he had before. It was a stunning admission of past failure, turned into policy. But even this second act was short-lived. The Danish threat didn't vanish with Sweyn's death. His son, Canute, later the Great, returned to press his claim. Ethelred died in 1016, in the middle of the war against Canute. His son Edmund Ironside would take up the fight, but died later that same year. Canute became king of England, and Ethelred's long, chaotic reign was over. So what are we left with? The image of Ethelred as the unready, the indecisive, dithering king, has persisted for centuries. But the term itself is misleading. The Old English word unrad doesn't mean unprepared. It means bad counsel, literally, without good advice. Ironically, Ethelred's nickname was a pun on his actual name. Ethelred means noble counsel, so Ethelred Unrad meant noble counsel, no counsel. It's less about him being ill-equipped and more about him being poorly advised, or unable to act on good advice. Modern historians have tried to reevaluate him in this light. Some stress that he ruled during a time of immense structural crisis, repeated invasions, unclear national identity, internal divisions, and an evolving military threat. The Viking campaigns of the late 10th and early 11th centuries were unlike the raids of the earlier period. They were sustained, well-funded, and often politically sophisticated. Few kings could have weathered them unscathed. Still, the criticisms remain. Ethelred failed to create a durable military strategy. He alienated potential allies. His policies, especially the massacres, created more enemies than they destroyed. His leadership was reactive rather than proactive, and in times of crisis, reaction is rarely enough. The real controversy of Ethelred's reign is not that he was a villain, it's that he was too ordinary for the moment. He governed a collapsing system as if it could still be patched up with coinage reforms and regional favors. He mistook the mechanisms of government for the substance of authority. And in doing so, he let the kingdom slip. In many ways, Ethelred's reign is a study in slow-motion collapse. Not dramatic, not glorious, but grinding. The kind of erosion that doesn't make for legend but leaves scars in memory. And perhaps that's why his story remains so contested, because it's not about failure in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about the failure to recognize how bad the odds had become. But as bad as things were under Ethelred, the next king wasn't interested in ruling from behind a treasury. He came with swords, with banners, and with the grim determination of a monarch raised on conquest. Because the hammer of the Scots wasn't a metaphor, it was a warning. And Edward Thrush would make sure no one in England, Wales, or Scotland would forget it. 12. King Edward III's Hammer of the Scots title is contested. Edward III didn't just believe in kingship, he believed in conquest. Tall, iron-willed, and fanatically devoted to law and legacy, Edward ruled not like a man who had inherited a crown, but like one trying to carve his initials into history with a war hammer. His reign, 1272-1307, is often remembered as a period of state-building, legal reform, and military brilliance. And it was, but all of those achievements came wrapped in contradictions: legalism and violence, reform and repression, unification and unrelenting domination. To his admirers, Edward was the model medieval king, brilliant administrator, accomplished warrior, and visionary lawmaker. To his enemies, especially those north of the River Tweed, he was something else entirely: a colonizer cloaked in ceremony, a destroyer of freedoms, and the prototype for centuries of English expansionism. His official nickname, Hammer of the Scots, speaks volumes, not just about what he did, but how he wanted to be remembered. But as with so many royal titles, the hammer swings both ways. Born in 1239, Edward was the son of Henry III, a king often seen as weak, pious, and politically overwhelmed. Edward, by contrast, was raised on the battlefield of rebellion. During the Second Barons' War, 1264-1267, Edward had watched his father struggle to contain a fractious nobility led by Simon de Montfort. Young Edward took matters into his own hands. He fought back, led royalist forces to victory at the Battle of Evesham, and helped reassert the power of the crown. He didn't forget what it took to do that. So when Edward became king in 1272, he had two missions: tighten control at home and expand authority abroad. The first he pursued through an ambitious agenda of legal reforms. He wasn't just issuing laws, he was building a system. Under his reign, English common law was standardized. Royal justices were sent across the realm to enforce order, and property disputes were brought under centralized control. The Statutes of Westminster laid down precedents that would echo for centuries. The king's writ now reached into towns, manors, and baronial courts alike. But these reforms, like all reforms, weren't neutral. They strengthened the monarchy, limited feudal fragmentation, and gave the crown unprecedented influence over the daily lives of its subjects. For those who benefited from more consistent law, especially merchants and loyal landowners, Edward was a force for good governance. But for powerful nobles used to more autonomy, this looked like royal overreach in legal armor. And that was just the beginning. Edward wasn't satisfied with reforming England. He wanted to shape the entire British Isles, by force if necessary. He began with Wales. In the 13th century, Wales was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of principalities and tribal loyalties, loosely dominated by the princes of Gwynedd. For decades, these Welsh rulers had engaged in power-balancing acts with the English crown. acknowledging overlordship when necessary, resisting it when possible. Edward decided to end the ambiguity. From 1276 to 1282, Edward launched a full-scale military campaign into Wales. It was brutal, calculated, and, by medieval standards, strategically advanced. Castles were constructed in concentric layers of stone and garrisoned with loyal troops. Roads and supply lines were fortified. Welsh resistance, led by Prince Llewellyn ap Gruffudd, was eventually crushed. Llewellyn was killed in battle. His brother Dafydd was captured and executed. Edward's conquest of Wales wasn't just military. It was architectural. He built a ring of castles so formidable that they still stand today. Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris. Stone testimonies to his vision of permanent dominance. In 1301, he gave his son the title Prince of Wales, initiating a tradition that continues to this day. It was a symbolic annexation, wrapped in lineage and ceremony. But if Edward believed the conquest of Wales proved the righteousness of his mission, he underestimated what would come next. Scotland. The situation there was murkier. In 1290, the Scottish royal line fell into crisis when the young Queen Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, died en route to her kingdom. With no clear heir, multiple claimants emerged. The Scots, to avoid civil war, asked Edward to arbitrate. He agreed, but on one condition: they recognize him as their overlord. Desperate to avoid internal bloodshed, the Scots complied, at least formally. Edward chose John Balliol as king, expecting a compliant vassal. But Balliol, under pressure from Scottish nobles, began asserting independence. In 1295, he allied with France, England's traditional enemy. That was enough. Edward invaded. What followed was the First War of Scottish Independence, a prolonged, ferocious struggle that would define Edward's legacy and ignite centuries of Anglo-Scottish conflict. In 1296, Edward marched into Scotland, captured key cities, and removed the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, to Westminster Abbey. It was a symbolic act of domination. Balliol was stripped of his crown and sent to the Tower of London. England now claimed direct control, but Scotland refused to submit. In 1297, resistance surged under a relatively unknown knight, William Wallace. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace's forces routed an English army. It was a shocking victory and a psychological blow to Edward's narrative of inevitability. Furious, Edward led a massive campaign north. In 1298, he crushed Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace fled, became a symbol, and was eventually captured and executed in 1305. But the damage to Edward's authority was done. Scotland had tasted rebellion, and it wasn't going away. In his final years, Edward became increasingly obsessed with completing his conquest. He planned another campaign into Scotland in 1307 but died en route. His body was buried in Westminster with a Latin inscription reportedly ordered by the king himself. "Here is Edward, the hammer of the Scots. Bury him deep, let him stay that way." It was part warning, part prophecy. But Edward's relationship with controversy isn't just about warfare. His treatment of Jews in England remains one of the darkest chapters of his reign. By the late 13th century, anti-Jewish sentiment had reached fever pitch. Accusations of usury, blood libel, and religious hostility fueled widespread resentment. In 1290, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion, expelling all Jews from England, one of the earliest large-scale expulsions in Europe. It was politically convenient, financially beneficial, and morally catastrophic. The move was not simply a reaction to public pressure. It also allowed Edward to confiscate debts and property. For many, it solidified Edward as a defender of the faith. But modern historians view it as an act of targeted intolerance that contributed to centuries of persecution across the continent. So how should we remember Edward? Was he a reformer or a tyrant? A state builder or an oppressor? A legalist or a conqueror? The truth, of course, is yes, to all of it. Edward's reign reshaped England and its neighbors with astonishing ambition. He centralized authority, professionalized the legal system, and expanded royal control. But he did so through conquest, coercion, and an unrelenting belief in his own righteousness. His reforms empowered some and crushed others. His campaigns unified England and left Wales and Scotland in mourning. Modern historians admire his intellect and political instinct, but are quick to point out the human cost. His legacy, like so many monarchs, is built on stones, castles, statues, law codes. But beneath them are graves, grievances, and unanswered questions. Because Edward believed in legacy. He believed in systems that would outlast him. But the system he built, of centralized monarchy, military conquest, and unchallenged authority, would not survive untouched. The very ambition that made Edward a legend would haunt his successors. And the boy he raised to inherit this legacy would find that no amount of castles or statutes could keep a crown safe from suspicion or rebellion. Because the next king on our list would inherit all of Edward's control mechanisms, but none of his charisma. And when the nobles rose against him, they wouldn't need armies. They'd just need paperwork and precedent, and the quiet belief that a king could once again be replaced. B. 13. King Henry VII. By the time Henry VII took the throne in 1485, England was tired, not just of war, but of kings. The Wars of the Roses had stretched over 3 decades, tearing apart noble houses, bankrupting the state, and making the crown feel less like a sacred inheritance and more like a hot potato passed between rival dynasties. The Plantagenet tree had been pruned with axes, allegiances had shifted like sand, pretenders popped up like weeds. The idea of legitimate kingship had become so muddled that when Henry Tudor, a man with a claim so tenuous it needed a ladder, arrived with an army from across the Channel, the country didn't reject him. It exhaled. But Henry VII's real controversy didn't lie in how he seized power. It lay in how he kept it. The Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, where Henry defeated and killed Richard III, marked not just the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, but the beginning of a new style of monarchy, colder, more calculated, and obsessed with permanence. Henry didn't take the throne as a warrior king or a reformer. He took it as a survivor, and he ruled like one. From the very beginning, Henry's position was precarious. His claim to the throne came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, whose lineage traced back to John of Gaunt, but through a line born out of wedlock and barred from succession by royal decree. He wasn't the next in line by blood. He was the next in line by default. Richard III had killed off or alienated most competitors, and Henry, after years of exile in Brittany and France, had managed to gather enough foreign backing and domestic discontent to make his move. Once crowned, Henry did what any pragmatic monarch would do. He rewrote the story. He backdated his reign to the day before Bosworth, legally making Richard's supporters traitors, even though he hadn't yet technically been king. He married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and niece of Richard III, not to unite the warring houses out of love or healing, but to neutralize a rival claim and present the image of dynastic harmony. The iconic red and white Tudor rose was propaganda in floral form. The House of Lancaster, red, and the House of York, white, now unified under one throne. In reality, the unification was brittle. Henry knew it, and he acted accordingly. The early years of his reign were defined by paranoia, not without cause. Pretenders to the throne began appearing almost immediately. The most famous was Lambert Simnel, a boy claimed by Yorkist conspirators to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, a legitimate Plantagenet still alive but imprisoned in the Tower of London. The rebels even had the audacity to crown Simnel King Edward VI in Dublin. Henry responded by parading the real Warwick through London, publicly exposing the fraud, and then, After crushing the rebellion, showing unexpected mercy by giving Simnel a job in the royal kitchens. It was brilliant politics. Ruthless where necessary, lenient where useful. But the threat didn't end there. In 1491, another claimant emerged, Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the infamous princes in the Tower. This was more dangerous. Warbeck gained support from foreign monarchs, Margaret of Burgundy, Maximilian of the Holy Roman Empire, and even James IV of Scotland. For nearly a decade, Warbeck posed a symbolic challenge to Henry's legitimacy, invading England multiple times and drawing support from domestic malcontents. Eventually, Warbeck was captured, imprisoned, and, after reportedly attempting to escape, executed in 1499. Alongside him, Henry had the real Earl of Warwick put to death, claiming the boy had conspired with Warbeck. In truth, Warwick had done nothing of the sort. But Henry wasn't taking chances. The execution of Warwick was perhaps Henry's most morally troubling act. The boy had been imprisoned for nearly his entire life, held as a political pawn and scapegoat. But he had royal blood. And in a regime as shaky as Henry's, blood was enough. Even with the threats suppressed, Henry remained vigilant. His administration evolved into something new for England, a government obsessed with financial control and bureaucratic enforcement. Henry's use of bonds and recognizances, legal tools that allowed the crown to fine nobles or bind them to good behavior through massive financial pledges, became legendary. It was legal extortion dressed as fiscal responsibility. Noble families lived in quiet terror of these tools. If you hosted too many armed retainers, if you failed to show deference, if you hinted at disloyalty, you might find yourself owing the crown thousands of pounds. The penalties didn't have to be enforced to work. The fear was enough. The king didn't need a sword. He had a ledger. Henry's most notorious financial enforcers, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, operated with ruthless efficiency. They scoured the country for technical violations, extracted money under legal pretexts, and filled the royal treasury with a cold, impersonal relentlessness that made them reviled. Their work helped make Henry one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe by the end of his reign. But it also earned the regime a reputation for greed and tyranny, one that his son would later exploit. And then there was the foreign policy, often overlooked, but no less revealing. Henry knew England couldn't compete militarily with continental giants like France and the Habsburg Empire. So he played a slower, subtler game. Marriage alliances, trade treaties, and calculated neutrality. His treaty with Spain, sealed by the marriage of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, was a masterstroke of dynastic legitimacy. His efforts to improve trade with the Netherlands and secure peaceful relations with Scotland through the marriage of his daughter Margaret to James IV were cautious, strategic, and deeply unromantic. Henry was not interested in glory. He was interested in control. Even his domestic policies reflected this. The crown's reach extended into boroughs and parishes like never before. Justices of the peace became crucial to royal administration. The Star Chamber, a council-like body that oversaw cases involving the powerful, began to take shape under his watch. It wasn't yet the instrument of abuse it would become under the Tudors, but its creation signaled a shift, from feudal consensus to bureaucratic enforcement. And yet, for all this cold efficiency, Henry VII is hard to dismiss. His reign ended a century of dynastic bloodshed. He stabilized the economy. He disciplined the nobility. He restored, or at least redefined, the authority of the monarchy. In doing so, he built the foundations for what would become the most infamous dynasty in English history. But make no mistake, this was not a golden age. It was a kingdom walking on eggshells. Henry rarely smiled in public. He avoided ostentation. His court was functional, not flamboyant. He dressed modestly. He counted everything: the Tudor legend, the pageantry, the decadence, the portraits. would come later, under his son. In life, Henry VII ruled like a man trying to outrun history. In death, he left behind a kingdom that had finally stopped bleeding, but at the cost of its breath. Even modern historians struggle with his legacy. Was he a miserly tyrant, squeezing the realm for coin and vengeance? Or was he a sober statesman, restraining a war-weary country from self-destruction? Was his obsession with financial control a personal vice or a rational response to national trauma? The answer, frustratingly, is both. Because Henry VII's controversy isn't just about how he ruled, it's about why he had to. He governed a country that no longer trusted kings, and he rebuilt that trust not with charm or charisma, but with silence, suspicion, and an accountant's patience. But his son would not inherit that patience. Where Henry VII was reserved, his heir would be theatrical. Where Henry avoided conflict, his son would manufacture it. And where Henry stabilized the throne through subtlety, his successor would burn the rulebook, then set the kingdom alight. Because if Henry VII ruled like a shadow, the next Tudor would rule like a fire. And England, once again, would be forced to decide how much it could endure for the illusion of strength. 14. King Richard II. Not every monarch is overthrown with a sword. Some are taken down with a signature, some with a parliament vote, and some, like Richard II, with a quiet collective shrug. Of all the English kings who lost their crown, Richard II's fall is perhaps the most emotionally ambiguous. It didn't explode like Charles I's public trial, nor did it end in a noble battlefield death like Richard III. Instead, it slipped out from under him, like a stage collapsing under an actor who never realized the audience had already left. And the controversy surrounding Richard isn't just about how he was deposed. It's about who he thought he was in the first place. Born in 1367, Richard became king at the age of 10 after the death of his grandfather, Edward III. His father, Edward the Black Prince, the heroic, charismatic war general, had died a year earlier, leaving behind a child too young to rule and a legacy too large to escape. England in 1377 was not a realm at peace. The 100 Years' War dragged on with inconsistent results. The economy was shaky, strained by plague aftershocks and taxation. And the nobility had become fractious, greedy, and impatient. Into this mess walked a boy with a crown, a regency council, and the monumental task of preserving royal authority when the throne itself looked less like a divine seat and more like an increasingly unstable chair. Richard's first real test came in 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. Sparked by economic hardship, labor laws, and the imposition of a deeply unpopular poll tax, the rebellion surged out of the southeast and reached London, dragging behind it the radical rhetoric of equality, justice, and no small amount of violence. At just 14, Richard met the rebels at Mile End and then at Smithfield. He spoke with authority. He promised reform. He told them, "You shall have no captain but me." And for a moment, it worked. The rebel leader, Wat Tyler, was killed. The movement collapsed. The court reasserted control. To many, Richard had shown early flashes of kingly greatness, but what followed was less inspiring. He immediately rescinded his promises, cracked down on dissent, and began to develop what would become a defining trait: a belief in personal, sacralized kingship, not as a job, but as an identity beyond criticism. Over the next 2 decades, Richard's rule oscillated between grand gestures and sullen silence. He surrounded himself with a close circle of courtiers, often resented by the nobility, and pushed forward an image of kingship that emphasized divine right, personal majesty, and ceremony over consensus. It was more than vanity. It was politics. Richard believed that the monarchy needed to be insulated from the political trench warfare of his nobles. He saw Parliament not as a partner, but as a tool to be managed. He spent extravagantly on art, architecture, pageantry, and his personal household, not merely out of personal indulgence, but because he thought these things reflected the dignity of the crown itself. But in a realm still reeling from financial strain, military failures, and regional instability, Richard's emphasis on royal grandeur felt misplaced. And his governing style didn't help. In the late 1380s, conflict broke out between Richard and a group of powerful aristocrats known as the Lords Appellant, including his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, the Duke of Gloucester, and others. They accused Richard's inner circle of corruption, mismanagement, and damaging the realm. Parliament, particularly the so-called Merciless Parliament of 1388, backed the Lords Appellant, leading to the execution or exile of several of Richard's favorites. This was not just a political defeat, it was a humiliation. Richard bided his time, and by the mid-1390s, he had clawed back power. But what followed wasn't reconciliation. It was revenge. He orchestrated a purge of his old enemies, arrested former allies, and pursued a quiet but ruthless campaign of consolidating authority. He began bypassing Parliament. He used legal technicalities to reassert crown prerogative. And most chillingly, he began targeting those who had once voted against him. Not out of immediate necessity, but seemingly out of delayed vengeance. In 1397, he arrested and eliminated key members of the Lords Appellant faction. He declared earlier acts of Parliament unlawful. He began ruling increasingly through decrees and emergency powers. The following year, he took the unprecedented step of exiling Henry Bolingbroke after a dispute with another noble, and then, upon the death of Henry's father, John of Gaunt, confiscated the entire Lancaster inheritance, a vast and wealthy estate. This last move would be his undoing. Henry Bolingbroke, stripped of his inheritance and exiled, returned in 1399 while Richard was campaigning in Ireland. What began as a mission to reclaim family lands quickly became a political revolution. Richard, isolated, mistrusted, and absent, failed to rally effective support. Henry, careful to frame his mission as a matter of justice rather than ambition, marched through England with little resistance. By the time Richard returned, it was already over. He was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned. Parliament declared Henry the rightful king. Richard's deposition was legal, procedural, and antiseptic. No violence, no rebellion, just a formal statement. The king has failed us. He died in captivity, likely in early 1400. The exact circumstances are unknown. Some sources suggest starvation. Others suggest murder. The details were conveniently obscured, and have remained so. So how do we make sense of Richard's controversy? Was he a tyrant, a visionary, a failed reformer, or a misunderstood idealist? Modern historians argue that Richard II represents one of the most complicated monarchs of medieval England. He wasn't cruel in the way we imagine tyrants. He didn't delight in bloodshed or crush peasants for sport. But he was dangerously rigid, emotionally fragile, and increasingly obsessed with a version of kingship that simply didn't match the political reality of his time. He saw himself as a king set apart, anointed, unanswerable, transcendent. But England, even in the 14th century, had grown used to a monarchy tempered by consensus. Richard's refusal to share power, to build alliances, or to accept criticism wasn't just a personality flaw. It became a constitutional crisis. And yet, he was also a patron of culture, a poet-king who sponsored writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and supported the flowering of English literature and art. He was one of the first English monarchs to use the royal image with such sophistication, commissioning elaborate portraits, using symbols of majesty to enhance his authority. He tried to make kingship beautiful, but he forgot to make it stable. In many ways, Richard was the first truly modern monarch, not because of his reforms, but because of his image. He understood the power of perception, of spectacle, of symbolism. He believed in the theater of power. But politics is not theater, it's survival. And Richard II, for all his grandeur, did not survive. His deposition set a precedent. Never again would English kings assume that divine right could shield them from political consequences. The House of Lancaster now held the throne, but its claim was built on deposition, not blood. And that, too, would have consequences. Because when you depose one king, you open the door to the idea that kingship itself is conditional. And the next king, the very man who replaced Richard, would spend his entire reign wrestling with the fact that legitimacy gained through revolt is legitimacy constantly under siege. A king may seize a crown, but can he ever escape the shadow of how he got it? 15. Queen Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was not supposed to be queen. She wasn't even supposed to be remembered. She was born into the minor nobility, clever, educated, and ambitious, yes. But in a world where women of her station were meant to orbit power, not become its gravitational center. And yet, in the twisted saga of Tudor politics, Anne Boleyn didn't just enter the narrative, she bent it. She became the focal point of a religious schism, a dynastic crisis, and a court intrigue so volatile that 6 centuries later, people are still arguing about what she did, what she said, and whether she ever had a chance. But one thing is clear, Anne Boleyn was never allowed to just be human. She was a symbol from the moment she entered the royal eye, and that is where the controversy began. Anne's story unfolds in the polished hallways of early 16th century court life, a place of whispered alliances, embroidered loyalty, and weaponized charm. She had spent her formative years in the Netherlands and France, absorbing Renaissance ideals, courtly manners, and the political subtlety that came with surviving royal courts as a woman with no direct power but every reason to play the game. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was not just another lady-in-waiting. She was fluent in French, intellectually agile, and dressed with a foreign sophistication that set her apart. She wasn't conventionally beautiful by the standards of the court. Even her enemies admitted that. But she had presence. And when presence meets ambition in a world run by men who believe they can have anything, something explosive is bound to happen. Enter Henry VIII. At first, it was the usual game. The king's attention, the polite flirtation, the slow escalation of interest. Anne had seen it before. Her sister Mary had been Henry's mistress. That path was familiar, predictable, and disposable. Anne refused it. She would not be a mistress. She would not be discarded. She wanted more. And for reasons historians still debate, Henry agreed. The pursuit of Anne Boleyn was not just a court romance. It became a political project. Henry sought a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, a queen whose only failure, in his eyes, was her inability to provide a surviving male heir. The Pope stalled. Catherine resisted. Anne waited. Years passed. Anne's enemies accused her of manipulating the king. Her allies framed her as the modern, reform-minded alternative to a stagnant, overly pious court. The truth is harder to pin down. Anne was politically astute and personally ambitious, but she was also trapped in the paradox of Tudor femininity. Be desirable, but not too powerful. Be virtuous, but not unyielding. Be obedient, but inspire action. When Henry finally broke with Rome to marry Anne in 1533, the scale of the gamble became clear. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a rupture. England was no longer in communion with the Catholic Church. The Pope's authority was rejected. The king declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and all of it, was blamed on Anne. The term homewrecker doesn't begin to cover it. To her supporters, Anne was the mother of religious reform in England, a Protestant heroine who nudged Henry away from papal tyranny and toward scriptural truth. To her enemies, she was Jezebel with better taste in headwear. But Anne wasn't just a religious symbol. She was a wife, and a queen expected to deliver a son. She didn't. In 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, a sharp, healthy, red-headed girl, but not a boy. Her second pregnancy ended in miscarriage, so did her third. Each time, the pressure grew. The court whispered. Henry looked elsewhere. It didn't help that Anne had never been universally liked at court. Her assertiveness was read as arrogance, her wit as insolence. She lacked the ability, or perhaps the interest, in pretending to be deferential. She expected to be taken seriously. And in a court that treated women as trophies or intercessors, that was dangerous. By 1536, Anne's enemies had mobilized. Jane Seymour, quiet, obedient, and conveniently the opposite of Anne in every political way, had caught Henry's attention. The same machine that had been used to elevate Anne now turned to dismantle her. The charges were breathtaking in their scope and absurdity. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. The evidence was flimsy, the witnesses pressured, and the verdict predetermined. Historians have combed through the records, the confessions, the trial transcripts. Most agree, the charges were political fiction. Anne's real crime was that she had stopped being useful. She was executed in May 1536, beheaded by a French swordsman brought in specially for the occasion. Even her death was curated, quick, clean, theatrical, like a queen in a tragedy, and like any good tragedy. Her death served multiple purposes. It removed a divisive political figure. It cleared the way for Henry to marry again. And it sent a message. Queens, too, could fall. But Anne's story didn't end on the scaffold. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to become one of the most formidable monarchs in English history. And the memory of Anne Boleyn, whether as a Protestant martyr, a social climber, or a proto-feminist icon, would echo through centuries of historical debate. Modern assessments of Anne are less interested in her as seductress or villain, and more interested in her as a case study in gendered power. She wasn't the first woman to be blamed for the actions of a king, and she wouldn't be the last. But she remains one of the most enduring. Because Anne Boleyn didn't just marry into controversy, she became its face. Her life, and her death, helped define the emotional vocabulary of Tudor politics. The personal as public, the intimate as ideological, the private fall as national spectacle. And yet, for all the drama, her story is ultimately one of survival, not for herself, but for the lineage she created. The daughter she left behind would remember her, even when others tried to erase her. Elizabeth never spoke publicly about her mother's execution, but in her reign, the Boleyn name was quietly rehabilitated. Anne's memory lived, not as a ghost, but as a whisper behind the throne. Because if Anne Boleyn had failed to produce a son, she had done something far more disruptive. She had produced a queen who would rule without a husband, without a son, and without apology. But that's a different story. For now, Anne's rise and fall serve as a warning and a pattern, because the next royal on our list would also be defined by gender, war, and relentless factional politics. She too would be accused of ambition, blamed for conflict, and remembered more for what was done to her than what she actually did. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And in the rhyme of power and propaganda, Queen Margaret of Anjou was a verse that echoed far louder than anyone expected. 16. Queen Margaret of Anjou. Some queens are remembered for their grace, others for their glamour, and a rare few for their unshakable influence over blood-soaked centuries. Queen Margaret of Anjou was none of these things. At least not how polite society would frame them. She was no passive consort, no mere symbol, no demure figure behind the throne. Instead, she was a storm with a crown. To understand Margaret's controversy, you must first understand the man she married. Henry VI, King of England. A man of gentle disposition, deep piety, and near catastrophic unsuitability for kingship in one of England's most turbulent centuries. Born in 1421, during the last phase of the 100 Years' War, Henry became king at just 9 months old when his father, the legendary warrior Henry V, died unexpectedly. And while his father had united England behind the myth of victory, the son would live out the consequences of that myth collapsing. By the time Margaret married Henry in 1445, at the age of 15, England was already teetering. The war in France, a once glorious campaign, had stalled, reversed, and begun bleeding the treasury dry. The nobility was restless, the king's advisors were divided, and the monarch himself, while kind-hearted, was dangerously disengaged from reality. Margaret, born in the Duchy of Lorraine and raised in a fiercely political French household, was thrown into this chaos with no script and no lifeline. Her marriage to Henry was not a love story. It was a peace offering, a strategic gesture during a lull in hostilities with France. As part of the marriage negotiations, England returned the valuable territory of Maine, enraging many English nobles and quietly hinting at weakness. So before she ever stepped foot in England, Margaret was controversial, viewed as a foreign queen bought at the price of English land. It was a detail that would never stop haunting her. But it was what came next that cemented her infamy. Henry VI was quite simply not up to the job. He lacked the authority to command his court, the will to resolve factional disputes, and, crucially, the health to maintain even a facade of power. In 1453, at the age of 32, he suffered a complete mental collapse. For over a year he was non-responsive, incapable of speech or decision, effectively absent from governance. And into that vacuum stepped Margaret. At just 23 years old, she took it upon herself to defend her son's claim, her newborn son, Edward of Westminster, the long-awaited heir to the Lancastrian line. The boy's legitimacy was immediately questioned. Rumors swirled that he wasn't really Henry's son, that Margaret had grown too close to certain advisors, most notably Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and that the line of succession had been poisoned by scandal. None of it was ever proven. But in a court already consumed by paranoia, truth mattered less than perception. And Margaret, by stepping into political leadership, made herself a lightning rod. She was no longer just the queen. She became, in the eyes of many, the de facto ruler of England. And that was unacceptable to the entrenched nobility. Her enemies were quick to label her overreaching, unnatural, and foreign. These weren't just personal attacks. They were political tools. Margaret's attempts to rally Lancastrian forces, protect her son's inheritance, and stabilize royal authority were framed as acts of tyranny, of manipulation, of ambition unbecoming of a woman, especially a queen. But Margaret didn't blink. As civil war erupted, what we now call the Wars of the Roses, Margaret emerged not as a background figure, but as the face of the Lancastrian cause. Her husband, incapable of leading troops or holding councils, faded further into ceremonial irrelevance. Margaret, meanwhile, raised armies, forged alliances, traveled across kingdoms, and fought tooth and nail for her son's right to rule. It was unprecedented. A queen consort leading military campaigns, negotiating with foreign powers, organizing political strategy. And unsurprisingly, it was controversial beyond measure. Margaret's enemies, primarily from the House of York, painted her as a meddling, bloodthirsty foreigner who had corrupted the king, divided the kingdom, and plunged the nation into war. Yorkist propaganda vilified her as the architect of every failed campaign, every unjust arrest, every political scandal. She was blamed for the imprisonment of the Duke of York, for the deaths at St. Albans, for the instability of the court, for the rise of Somerset, even when her influence was, at times, limited by shifting fortunes. Was she a manipulator? Perhaps. But she was also a mother protecting her child in a realm that refused to give her the tools to do so. In 1460, the war reached its first boiling point. The Duke of York claimed the throne outright, declaring Henry VI unfit. Parliament forced a compromise. Henry would remain king for life, but York's heirs would inherit the crown, disinheriting Margaret's son Edward. It was a stunning political maneuver, a temporary peace, and a personal betrayal. Margaret rejected it completely. She rallied what forces she could and fought back. The result? The Battle of Wakefield, where the Duke of York was killed, his head displayed on the walls of York with a paper crown mockingly placed atop. A moment of Lancastrian triumph, followed swiftly by Yorkist revenge. In 1461, at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, the Yorkists crushed the Lancastrians. Edward IV, son of the slain Duke of York, seized the throne. Henry VI was driven into hiding. Margaret and her son fled into exile. But exile didn't end her controversy. It only transformed it. For the next decade, Margaret became a political vagabond, negotiating with Scotland, France, and rebellious English nobles. She even aligned, however briefly, with the former Yorkist Earl of Warwick, once her fiercest enemy, in a desperate bid to restore Henry VI. That alliance briefly succeeded in 1470, restoring Henry to the throne for a flickering moment. But it was too late. England had moved on. In 1471, Edward IV returned, reasserted his claim, and obliterated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed. Henry VI, captured and held in the Tower, was quietly eliminated. Margaret, broken and defeated, was imprisoned, later ransomed by the French, and spent the rest of her life in obscurity, dying in 1482, largely forgotten. And yet, her memory never stayed quiet. Margaret of Anjou remains one of the most polarizing women in English history. To her critics, she was the very image of political disaster, divisive, aggressive, reckless. A woman who overstepped, who cost the realm decades of peace, who dragged a country through war over personal pride and maternal obsession. To her defenders, she was something far rarer. A woman who refused to be a victim, who saw a broken system, an absent husband, a vulnerable son, and chose to fight instead of fade. Her leadership may have been flawed. Her strategies often backfired. But the fact that she led it all, in a world that offered women nothing but caution and silence, is remarkable. Modern historians are re-evaluating her legacy with more nuance. They see her not as a villainess or a saint, but as a political actor in a collapsing system. A person thrust into impossible circumstances, forced to play a game stacked entirely against her. A queen who didn't just survive the storm, she helped shape it. She didn't win, but she never surrendered her agency. And in that sense, her story echoes through history, especially when we look at how the crown itself would continue to be contested, redefined, and reshaped in the years to come. Because the man finally claimed the throne after her, a man who took it not through birthright but through battlefield, would usher in an entirely new dynasty. He would rebrand monarchy itself, tighten its grip, and build a legacy out of the ruins Margaret had fought to defend. But make no mistake, without her, the war wouldn't have burned as long, or ended where it did, and the Tudor myth would have had no battlefield to rise from. 17. King Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke. Some monarchs inherit power. Others are handed it. Henry Bolingbroke took it, and that single act would haunt his dynasty for generations. To depose a king and live long enough to die in your bed was an anomaly in medieval England. But Henry IV did just that. He seized the throne from his cousin Richard II in 1399 and ruled for 14 contentious years. His reign was not marked by glory, expansion, or prosperity. It was a reign defined by legitimacy, or rather, the lack of it. Because when your crown rests on a claim that's legal only because you say it is, everything else becomes a reaction to that problem. Every policy, every rebellion, every rebellion's rumor, all orbit the same black hole. You were not supposed to be king. Let's go back to how he got there. Born in 1367, Henry Bolingbroke was the son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and grandson of Edward III. In terms of royal blood, he was high-ranking, but not next in line. That honor belonged to Richard II, son of Edward the Black Prince, who took the throne as a child. Henry and Richard grew up together, cousins, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. At first, Henry supported his cousin. He participated in military campaigns, sat in Parliament, and joined noble councils. But Richard's rule began to spiral. He distrusted the nobility, leaned into absolutist rule, and developed a reputation for vindictiveness. His personal style of governance clashed sharply with the baronial power base that had helped stabilize the realm. Richard exiled Henry in 1398 after a dispute between Henry and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. It was supposed to be for 10 years. But within a year, John of Gaunt died, and Richard seized Henry's inheritance. That was the fatal misstep, because what Henry returned to England for was not initially the crown. It was his land. But he found something more valuable: political opportunity. Richard had made himself deeply unpopular with many nobles and had traveled to Ireland to put down a rebellion, leaving England politically exposed. When Henry landed in Yorkshire in 1399, his claim was framed carefully, not as a usurper, but as a wronged noble seeking justice. Nobles, sensing the shift, joined him. Castles opened their gates. Richard was captured. And in one of the most stunning constitutional moments in medieval English history, he was forced to abdicate. Henry Bolingbroke became King Henry IV, not by birthright, but by political engineering. His coronation was surrounded by carefully curated symbolism. He took the throne wearing Edward III's coronation robes. He made speeches about justice, unity, and God's will. But none of it could erase the fact that the precedent had now been set. A king could be removed by Parliament, by nobles, by force. And if it could happen once, it could happen again. Henry's early reign was immediately challenged by unrest. The first major threat was the Epiphany. Rising in 1400, a plot by former Richard loyalists to assassinate Henry and restore the deposed monarch. The attempt failed, but it revealed the fragility of Henry's rule. Then Richard II died in custody under unclear circumstances. The official story was starvation. Some said illness, others assassination. Henry ordered his body displayed publicly to prove he was dead, but the move only intensified rumors. Did Henry have Richard murdered, or was it just politically convenient? History has no clear answer, and Henry never provided one. Regardless, the death of Richard did not end the threats. If anything, it encouraged them. Between 1400 and 1415, Henry's reign was plagued by rebellion. The most serious came in 1403 from the Percy family, once his allies, now bitter enemies. Henry Hotspur Percy, whose charisma and military success made him a natural rival, allied with Owain Glyndwr's Welsh rebels and turned on the king. At the Battle of Shrewsbury, Henry faced his most dangerous internal threat. The battle was fierce, bloody, and personal. Hotspur was killed, the rebellion crushed, but the underlying instability remained. Meanwhile, Owain Glyndwr's Welsh rebellion raged on for over a decade. For many, Glyndwr was a symbol of national identity, resisting the English crown's expansion. His movement drew support from disaffected nobles, foreign allies, and rural populations who saw in him a protector against exploitation and centralization. Henry's forces never fully extinguished the rebellion. The Welsh countryside became a quagmire of skirmishes, ambushes, and prolonged resistance. It was a humiliation that Henry couldn't publicly admit, but it drained his resources and authority. Add to this the financial strain. Wars are expensive. Rebellions are worse. Henry had to rely on Parliament more frequently for taxation, and each request became a negotiation. Parliament began asserting itself more boldly, asking for reforms, financial audits, and transparency. In many ways, Henry's reign saw the early stages of what would become a much more involved, and eventually antagonistic, Parliament. The irony? Henry had taken the throne promising unity. He ruled amid constant division. And then there was his health. In his later years, Henry suffered from a mysterious illness. Some say skin disease, others a circulatory condition, possibly even strokes. He became withdrawn. He relied heavily on counselors and, increasingly, his eldest son, the future Henry V. This gave rise to the Shakespearean image of Prince Hal, the rowdy youth, tavern brawler, and reluctant heir. The contrast between the anxious father and the carefree son became legend. Whether or not the reality matched the play, the tension between Henry and his heir reflected the deeper anxiety of the crown itself. What was kingship now? Sacred? Practical? Conditional? Henry IV had broken the spell of divine right. The throne no longer glowed with God's chosen authority. It was now conditional, fragile, and negotiable. And that legacy is his greatest controversy. He did not reform the monarchy, but he shook its foundation. He did not inspire loyalty, but he revealed how quickly it could vanish. His reign was neither glorious nor disastrous. It was deeply human, full of improvisation, insecurity, and the lingering consequences of one bold decision. When he died in 1413, Henry IV left behind a stabilized kingdom, but only just. His son, Henry V, would burnish the Lancastrian legacy in Agincourt and national myth. But the cracks remained, and those cracks would widen under his grandson, Henry VI, leading back into civil war. So, was Henry IV a tyrant? No. A reformer? Not quite. A usurper? Certainly. But also a political survivor in a time when survival was a victory in itself. And his story ends not with a bang, but with a subtle question that England would keep asking for centuries: if a king can be, replaced. Why not this one? Because when the monarchy becomes conditional, the realm never forgets. And the next royal on our list, one with a claim even thinner, whose reign began in civil war and ended in myth, would take Henry's precedent and transform it into dynasty. But he would do so with calculation, caution, and an iron grip on narrative itself. Because when your name is Henry Tudor, survival isn't enough. You have to make people believe you belong there all along. 18. King Stephen. In a kingdom used to chaos, King Stephen managed to make instability feel like tradition. He wasn't born to rule, but then again, very few truly were in 12th century England. Royal blood was a relative thing, close enough if it ran thick with ambition. Stephen of Blois, a grandson of William the Conqueror through his mother, Adela, had just enough lineage to matter and just enough charm to make people believe he could carry it. But when King Henry I died in 1135, he left no surviving sons. What he left instead was a promise that his daughter, Empress Matilda, would succeed him. It was bold, radical. A woman, ruling in her own right? It had never happened before in England. But Henry had made the barons swear fealty to her. Twice. Oaths were taken. Hands were kissed. The future seemed, if not certain, then at least theoretically secure. And then Henry died, and Stephen moved. Within days of Henry's death, Stephen sailed from Bologna, landed in England, and claimed the crown. It wasn't treason exactly, it was improvisation. He argued that England needed a king, not a queen. That Matilda, married to Geoffrey of Anjou, a man deeply unpopular with the Anglo-Norman barons, would threaten the balance of power. That Stephen, conveniently, was already here and already approved by God, or at least by a few bishops. In December 1135, he was crowned King of England. And that's when everything fell apart. The period that followed, known to history as the Anarchy, is one of the most chaotic in English royal history. For nearly 2 decades, the kingdom would be torn between Stephen and Matilda, between legitimacy and expediency, between law and force. At first, Stephen looked like a capable ruler. He moved quickly to consolidate power, handing out land and titles with cheerful abandon to secure loyalty. but his generosity was not matched by control. Nobles began building unauthorized castles, raising private armies, and expanding their power at the expense of the crown. England was becoming a patchwork of competing fiefdoms, a medieval Wild West with stone keeps instead of saloons. And then Matilda struck back. In 1139, she landed in England with a small but formidable force, including her half-brother Robert of Gloucester. A key defection followed. Stephen's own brother, Henry of Blois, the powerful Bishop of Winchester, switched allegiances. The war had become personal. At the heart of the conflict was a question England had never truly confronted. Could a woman rule in her own name? Matilda, the Empress, the daughter of a king, the widow of a Holy Roman Emperor, believed she could. But she quickly discovered that pedigree meant little against deeply ingrained prejudice. Her military campaigns were often successful, her intelligence undeniable, but her manner, described by hostile chroniclers as proud and haughty, alienated some of the nobles who might have supported her. Her most dramatic moment came in 1141, when Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln. With the king imprisoned, Matilda entered London to prepare for her coronation. But instead of a triumph, she met with hostility. The city turned on her. The barons wavered. Her support collapsed. She was forced to flee, a queen almost crowned, undone not by defeat, but by discomfort. Stephen was released in a prisoner exchange. The war resumed, and so it dragged on. Years of sieges, shifting loyalties, and petty conflicts. Local lords exploited the chaos to increase their power. Castles changed hands overnight. Laws became suggestions. Taxes turned into extortion. The chroniclers described it bleakly. Christ and his saints slept. And still, Stephen remained on the throne. Not because he was a great king, he wasn't. His leadership was inconsistent, his judgment frequently questioned, and his court often divided. He had a gift for attracting loyalty, but not for keeping it. He lacked the ruthlessness of his contemporaries. And yet, he endured. Part of that endurance came from Matilda's limitations. She had no clear succession plan, and though her claim was strong, her political instincts, especially with the English nobility, were less reliable. But that changed in 1147, when her teenage son, Henry of Anjou, made his first military appearance in England. The campaign failed. He was too young, too inexperienced, but it introduced a new player into the game. The future Henry II. Stephen, sensing the shift, made one final gambit. He designated his own son, Eustace, as heir, trying to secure the crown for his family. But Eustace was widely disliked and, more crucially, viewed as part of a dynastic experiment that had failed. When Eustace died unexpectedly in 1153, Stephen's resolve broke. Later that year, at the Treaty of Winchester, Stephen agreed to a compromise. He would remain king for life, but upon his death, the crown would pass to Henry of Anjou. The war was over. The anarchy technically ended. Stephen died in 1154. He was buried in Faversham Abbey, a king who had ruled for nearly 2 decades and yet left behind little but questions. Was he a usurper or a stabilizer? A decent man overwhelmed by events or a weak ruler who allowed England to unravel? Modern historians tend to see him more sympathetically than earlier chroniclers. They point out that he inherited a kingdom already poised for conflict, that Henry I's decision to name a female heir without preparing the country for such a change was a gamble that backfired. They note that Stephen's loyalty to his friends, his reluctance to use excessive force, and his personal charm were qualities that endeared him to some, even as they undermined his control. But the controversy remains. Stephen's reign represents a crisis of succession, a period when rules were rewritten, oaths broken, and institutions tested. His decision to seize the crown set a precedent. That proximity and ambition could outweigh legitimacy. That the monarchy was not an unbreakable chain, but a series of choices, gambits, and fragile claims. And in the end, perhaps that's the real legacy of Stephen's controversy. He showed England what it looked like when the idea of kingship came unmoored from its divine mystique and had to survive in the realm of politics, perception, and public consent. He passed the crown to Henry II, a man raised in the chaos Stephen had failed to resolve. And that next king, raised in exile, brilliant, brutal, endlessly energetic, would attempt to rebuild what had been broken. But in doing so, he would discover that order, once lost, never returns without cost. Because when you restore power, you don't just inherit the throne. You inherit every ghost that came with it. 19. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just walk through English history. She stormed through it, crown tilted, opinions blazing, and a legacy that refuses to sit quietly in the corner of medieval footnotes. She was one of the most powerful women in European history, and for centuries, her reputation has ricocheted between scandal and admiration, myth and misreading. Because Eleanor was never simply a queen. She was a duchess, a strategist, a patron of the arts, a mother of monarchs, and, most controversially, a political player in a world built to exclude her. Born around 1122, Eleanor inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine at a young age after the death of her father, William X. Aquitaine was no minor holding. It was a massive, culturally rich region in what is now southwestern France, and its independence gave Eleanor extraordinary leverage in a marriage market dominated by dynastic utility. She was 15 when she married Louis VII of France in 1137, becoming Queen of France just weeks later when his father died unexpectedly. Her first controversy? Being more capable than her husband. Louis VII was pious, serious, and politically cautious. Eleanor was vibrant, well-read, and unafraid to speak her mind. They were, in almost every way, incompatible. A mismatch of temperament and ambition. But the real rift came during the Second Crusade. Eleanor accompanied Louis on the journey to the Holy Land, rare for a queen, exceptional in scope. There she defied expectations, wearing armor, leading contingents of her vassals, and reportedly exerting political influence in military matters. Chroniclers, almost exclusively male, clerical, and none too fond of outspoken women, were scandalized. Rumors swirled that Eleanor had conducted herself improperly, with some even alleging flirtation or worse with her own uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch. There's no credible evidence to support these accusations, but the damage was done. The crusade failed. The royal marriage broke. And in 1152, Eleanor's marriage to Louis was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related, conveniently discovered after 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters. The underlying reason, of course, was that Eleanor had failed to produce a male heir. That, and she refused to be silent and obedient. Here's where the story swerves, from interesting to history-shaping. Just weeks after the annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, 11 years her junior, ambitious, energetic, and soon enough, the future King Henry II of England. This union brought together 2 massive territories, the English crown and the Duchy of Aquitaine, laying the foundation for what historians later called the Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. It also ensured Eleanor a place not just at the heart of English monarchy, but at the sharp edge of its power struggles. The early years of her marriage to Henry were fruitful, politically and literally. Eleanor bore 8 children, including 2 future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John, yes, that John. But her influence wasn't confined to motherhood. She governed Aquitaine with relative autonomy, maintained her own court, and promoted a culture of chivalry and poetry that would later shape the medieval ideal of courtly love. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of her independence, her relationship with Henry deteriorated. He was notoriously unfaithful and increasingly autocratic. She, unsurprisingly, resented being sidelined. The real controversy erupted in the 1170s when Eleanor supported a rebellion by her sons against Henry. Whether she instigated it or merely supported it remains debated, but either way, she crossed a line no medieval queen consort was supposed to cross. She turned against the king. The rebellion failed. Eleanor was captured, and for the next 16 years, she was imprisoned. Not in a dungeon, but under comfortable, closely guarded house arrest. The official narrative was silence. The reality? An attempt to erase her political presence. Kings could afford unruly barons, but not unruly queens. But Eleanor didn't vanish. She waited. And when Henry II died in 1189, it was Eleanor who re-entered public life with astonishing force. Her son, Richard I, now king, immediately released her, and she became the power behind the throne, not just for Richard, but later for John as well. She traveled across Europe to negotiate marriages, handle diplomacy, secure hostages, manage regencies, and navigate political landmines with an ease that made even her enemies admit she was formidable. Her final decades were marked by wisdom, calculation, and a quiet authority that far outstripped many of the kings she had known. Yet the controversies never stopped. Throughout her life, Eleanor was accused of everything from adultery to inciting rebellion to overstepping her gendered role. Much of it was rooted less in her actions and more in the fact that she acted at all. Chroniclers called her meddlesome, manipulative, unnatural, the classic labels used to discredit powerful women in patriarchal systems. Modern historians are far more measured. They recognize that Eleanor was navigating a brutal political world with wit, ambition, and remarkable resilience. Her court of love in Poitiers may or may not have existed as described, but the cultural legacy she left is unmistakable. Still, the legend complicates the legacy. Popular portrayals, from 19th century romanticism to 20th century films, have often reduced her to caricatures. The fiery temptress, the scorned queen, the long-suffering mother. But none of these simplifications do justice to her actual life, which was shaped by political calculation, diplomatic skill, and a refusal to be irrelevant. Eleanor died in 1204 at the age of roughly 82, extraordinary longevity for a medieval royal. She retired to Fontevraud Abbey, where she took the veil but never relinquished her status. Even in semi-retirement, she remained a political figure, orchestrating alliances and securing the future of her lineage. She was buried beside Henry II and Richard I. 3 rulers, 2 generations, 1 legacy. And while the Church may have tried to canonize silence in queenship, Eleanor turned volume into survival. She outlived most of her enemies, outmaneuvered most of her obstacles, and redefined what a queen could be. Not a consort, not an ornament, but a player in the game. The controversies that surrounded her weren't born of scandal. They were born of discomfort. Discomfort with a woman who refused to obey the script. And her story becomes even more significant when you look at what came after. Because her sons inherited her fire, but not always her foresight. The son who followed her, a warrior poet king who preferred crusades to policy, would be lionized by legend but haunted by failure. And the other son? He'd become one of the most reviled kings in English history. But before we get there, it's Richard who takes the throne next. The boy she raised, the hero she outlived, and the king whose glory may have come at the cost of the very crown he wore. 20. King George IV. If image were everything, George IV might have ruled a golden age, but behind the polished portraits, the dazzling architecture, and the lavish court rituals was a monarch so divisive, so extravagantly self-defeating, that even his own father refused to trust him with power for decades. Few English kings have been as thoroughly mocked by their contemporaries, or as spectacularly out of step with their times, as George IV, the prince who waited too long and reigned too little, and who, in the meantime, turned controversy into a lifestyle. Born in 1762, George Augustus Frederick was the eldest son of King George III. As heir apparent, he carried the hopes of a stable dynasty in a rapidly changing world. But almost from the start, he rejected the burdens of rule in favor of its trappings. He adored fashion, art, music, and theater. He cultivated friendships with playwrights and painters. He poured money into lavish estates and extravagant renovations, and he lived far beyond his means. His father, George III, a monarch often remembered for his periods of mental instability, but also for his sense of duty and frugality, was appalled by the Prince of Wales's excess. The two men clashed constantly, particularly over money. Parliament was frequently called upon to bail out the prince's debts, often to public fury. Satirists had a field day. George IV became a walking punchline long before he ever wore the crown. The real trouble began with marriage. In 1785, George secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Roman Catholic. The marriage was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the king's consent for any union involving royal descendants. And a union with a Catholic would have disqualified him from the succession under the laws of the time. But George wasn't thinking of legality. He was thinking of romance, or possibly rebellion. Either way, the marriage, though emotionally significant to him, had no standing in law. When it came time to arrange a legitimate royal marriage, George begrudgingly agreed to wed Caroline of Brunswick, a German princess who, in theory, ticked the political boxes. In practice, it was a disaster from the start. The couple reportedly disliked each other at first sight. Their wedding was awkward, their cohabitation brief, and their affection non-existent. One child was born, Princess Charlotte, but the marriage collapsed almost immediately after. From there, the scandal turned public. George refused to live with Caroline. She left the country. He paraded his mistresses through court with little attempt to disguise them. And when his father finally succumbed to illness in 1811, George became Prince Regent, effectively king in all but name. As regent, George had an opportunity to rebrand. Britain was emerging from the Napoleonic Wars. The monarchy could have used a revival, some vision, some sense of responsibility. Instead, George doubled down on spectacle. He expanded Carlton House. He began the transformation of Buckingham House into the palace we know today. He commissioned the construction of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, an exotic, domed fantasia inspired by Indian and Chinese architecture. It was glorious and expensive and widely derided as an absurd vanity project. Meanwhile, the British people suffered. Economic hardship followed the wars. Unemployment, food shortages, and demands for parliamentary reform sparked unrest. The 1819 Peterloo Massacre, where a cavalry charge into a peaceful protest in Manchester left multiple dead, shocked the nation. And while the government cracked down, George offered no comfort, no reform, and no public sympathy. He was distant, distracted, and perpetually preoccupied with his own image. And then came the trial of the century. When George finally ascended the throne in 1820 after the death of George III, he sought to bar Caroline from being recognized as queen. She had returned to England, claiming her rightful title, and the king's reaction was swift and ruthless. He pushed for a bill of pains and penalties, a legislative effort to strip her of her title and dissolve the marriage on grounds of adultery. The result was a national scandal. Public opinion swung in Caroline's favor. She was seen as the wronged wife, the outsider humiliated by a corrupt and indulgent monarch. Crowds gathered in protest, newspapers fumed, and though the bill passed the House of Lords narrowly, it was abandoned due to overwhelming public backlash. Caroline was not crowned alongside George at his coronation in 1821. She was, in fact, barred from attending, and she died shortly after, adding martyrdom to the myth. It was the darkest moment in George IV's public life, and perhaps the most revealing. He had power, but no popularity. He had wealth, but no wisdom. He had the throne, but not the respect that came with it. His later reign was marked by physical decline and increasing isolation. He grew enormously overweight, took large doses of laudanum for chronic pain, and withdrew from public life. He kept obsessively editing portraits of himself to appear slimmer and more regal, a vain attempt to control perception in a world that had long since made up its mind. And yet, amid the controversy, there were achievements. George IV was a genuine patron of the arts. He supported the architect John Nash, sponsored urban improvements in London, and left behind some of the most iconic buildings in modern British architecture. The Regency style in design and decor, with its neoclassical elegance, owes much to his taste. He was also, however indirectly, a figure presiding over the slow liberalization of British society. The Catholic Emancipation Act would be passed under his successor, but the political debates began under his reign. The old system was creaking, and though George IV resisted every effort at reform, his failures helped make its necessity obvious. By the time he died in 1830, aged 67, few mourned. His only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, had died years earlier in childbirth, leaving the succession to his younger brother, who would become William IV. His legacy was mixed and heavily shaped by ridicule. Modern historians have tried, with limited success, to rehabilitate him. Some emphasize his cultural contributions, his aesthetic sense, and his role in shaping the visual identity of the monarchy. Others focus on his failures, political, personal, and symbolic. The truth is, George IV was a man who tried to embody majesty without ever earning it. He believed in monarchy as theater, but neglected the responsibilities of the script. His life was one long performance, ornate, expensive, occasionally brilliant, and ultimately tragic. And as we move from his reign into the 20th century, that central contradiction, monarchy as image versus monarchy as institution, will rear its head again, but this time the drama won't play out in palaces or parliament. It will play out in front of the press, under the flashbulbs, in the court of public opinion. Because up next is a king who would sacrifice the throne itself, not for art or architecture or ambition, but for love. Or so the story goes. 21. King Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. He was born to be king, groomed, polished, praised. The eldest son of George V, heir to an empire on which the sun famously refused to set. In the public eye, Edward VIII was the Golden Prince, handsome, modern, magnetic. He embodied a new kind of royalty for a new kind of world, casual, charming, a little rebellious. For a generation scarred by war and economic hardship, he represented not continuity, but change. And then, less than a year after ascending the throne, he gave it all away. The story of Edward VIII is so soaked in myth and tabloid shorthand that it's easy to forget just how complicated and controversial his brief reign really was. The popular version goes something like this: boy meets girl, boy becomes king, boy abdicates for love. It's romantic, tragic, noble even. But the truth? The truth is a constitutional earthquake dressed up as a love story, a scandal that reshaped the monarchy, not just who wore the crown, but what the crown could survive. Let's begin with the woman, Wallis Simpson. American, divorced, and then divorced again. She wasn't just unsuitable by royal standards, she was unspeakable. To the British establishment in the 1930s, Wallis represented everything dangerous: foreign influence, social disruption, moral decay. But Edward didn't care. Or more accurately, he didn't appear to care. He pursued her publicly, insisted on her presence at royal events, and made it clear that he intended to marry her. This wasn't just a personal decision. It was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. As head of the Church of England, the monarch was expected to uphold the Church's teachings, including its opposition to remarriage after divorce, particularly while the former spouse was still living. Wallis's first husband was alive. Her second marriage was dissolving. For Edward to marry her while king would violate both religious convention and political precedent. And yet he was adamant. From the moment he became king in January 1936, Edward showed little interest in governance. He delayed paperwork, avoided briefings, and often left ministers waiting while he took personal calls. His focus remained fixed on Wallis and the mounting pressure from all sides, Parliament, the Church, and the Commonwealth, to abandon the relationship. Behind closed doors, the situation was dire. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin warned Edward that the government would resign en masse if he married Simpson. Canada, Australia, South Africa, all signaled their opposition. The monarchy was a symbolic head of a global constitutional framework, and that framework was not built for romantic improvisation. Edward had three choices: give up Wallis, marry her, and provoke a political collapse, or abdicate. He chose the last. On December 11, 1936, Edward became the first English monarch to voluntarily relinquish the crown. In a brief, carefully worded radio broadcast, he addressed the nation with the now famous line, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." It was short, dignified, and deeply misleading. Because Edward didn't just walk away from kingship. He walked into a different kind of notoriety, one that would follow him and Wallis for the rest of their lives. He was created Duke of Windsor, married Wallis in France in 1937, and spent much of the rest of his life in self-imposed semi-exile. But the controversies didn't end with his abdication. If anything, they escalated. During the Second World War, Edward's behavior raised eyebrows and, in some cases, alarm. Appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1940, a post designed to keep him far from Europe and far from influence, he and Wallis lived in colonial luxury while the world burned. Meanwhile, intelligence services in Britain and the U.S. collected evidence suggesting that the Duke had engaged in questionable conversations with German officials prior to the war. Some documents hinted at dangerous naivety. Others implied something darker: sympathies with authoritarian regimes, or at the very least, a staggering failure to grasp the moment. The so-called Marburg Files, discovered after the war, included intercepted Nazi correspondence indicating that the German leadership saw Edward as a potentially useful ally, even a possible puppet monarch should Britain be defeated. The full truth remains debated, and much of the evidence is circumstantial. But the damage was real. Within the royal family, Edward became a ghost at the banquet. He was excluded from key events, distanced from ceremonial life, and perhaps most painfully, estranged from his mother and siblings. His relationship with his brother, King George VI, never fully recovered. His niece, Queen Elizabeth II, maintained a cautious distance throughout her reign. And public opinion? It was split. For some, he remained a romantic figure, the king who gave up everything for love. For others, he was a cautionary tale, self-absorbed, politically reckless, and emotionally immature. A man who mistook personal happiness for national duty and paid for it with a legacy permanently stuck between scandal and sentimentality. Modern historians have tried to reframe his abdication, less as a great romantic gesture and more as a crisis of leadership. They argue that Edward was unsuited to monarchy long before Wallis arrived, that he lacked the discipline, gravitas, and political intuition needed for the job, that the romance was real but the consequences were institutional. And yet, for all the criticism, it's undeniable that his exit reshaped the royal family. It placed George VI on the throne, a shy, stammering second son who rose to the occasion during Britain's darkest hour. It set the stage for Elizabeth II's long reign. And it forced the monarchy to confront a new age of accountability, media scrutiny, and emotional restraint. In the end, Edward died in 1972 in Paris, with Wallace by his side. He was buried at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle, not far from the family he had left behind, but never truly rejoined. His life is remembered less for what he did as king than for what he chose not to do. He didn't lead. He didn't govern. He didn't reform. He walked away. And while the abdication crisis remains one of the most dramatic episodes in royal history, it also left a lingering question that the monarchy has never quite escaped. What happens when duty and personal desire collide? Because the next queen on our list would live at the opposite end of that spectrum, someone who wore the crown for more than 60 years, who became a symbol of duty itself, and yet whose reign, for all its public dignity, carried its own quiet controversies. Not because she walked away from the crown, but because she wore it too well for too long and perhaps too silently. 22. Queen Victoria. She was only 18 when she became queen, small in stature, politically inexperienced, and newly freed from a controlling mother and a domineering advisor. No one expected her to define an era, least of all herself. And yet Queen Victoria, quiet, cautious, famously fond of pugs, would come to represent an empire, a century, and an institution trying to survive its own weight. Her reign, from 1837 to 1901, remains the second longest in British history. But its sheer length isn't what makes it controversial. What defines Victoria's legacy is the uneasy collision of symbolism and silence. She became an icon of national identity while personally withdrawing from public life. She embodied the stability of monarchy while presiding over some of the most turbulent shifts in British history. She was, depending on who you asked, either the glue that held a fracturing empire together or the velvet curtain behind which those fractures deepened. And that contradiction starts early. Victoria inherited the throne from her uncle, William IV, after a line of elderly and childless kings had left the crown with nowhere else to go. In her early reign, she was buoyed by the guidance of Lord Melbourne, her first prime minister, whose mentorship gave her both confidence and political clout. But even then, she wasn't without critics. She played politics more actively than was considered proper for a young woman, especially a monarch. Her handling of the so-called bedchamber crisis in 1839, when she refused to dismiss her ladies-in-waiting at the request of Robert Peel, drew criticism and highlighted a core tension in her reign. How much power should a constitutional monarch really have? The answer kept changing, and so did Victoria. Her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840 brought emotional and intellectual stability to her court. Albert was not just a consort, he was her advisor, her partner, and in many ways the de facto co-sovereign. He steered her away from factional politics and toward a more restrained ceremonial monarchy. He promoted science, education, and what he considered moral seriousness. But this came with a shift in tone. Victoria and Albert reshaped the monarchy into a symbol of domestic virtue, a royal family not of divine right, but of moral example. Their image was calculated, harmonious, orderly, respectable. The middle-class monarchy, historians have called it. But behind the imagery was a court increasingly detached from the struggles of ordinary citizens. Victoria's controversies rarely exploded. They simmered. And one of the most significant came not in what she did, but what she didn't do. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria retreated into mourning and stayed there. She wore black for the rest of her life. She withdrew from public ceremonies. She avoided London. She allowed her ministers to handle the government while she remained in secluded grief. For a time, she all but disappeared from national life. And the nation noticed. The 1860s and 1870s saw a rising Republican sentiment in Britain. Newspapers and pamphlets asked what exactly the monarchy was for. Demonstrations were held. Satirists mocked her seclusion. Politicians debated the utility of a crown that refused to show up. Victoria's absence created a paradox. The more she retreated, the more she became a symbol. Invisibility became myth. Her silence became a mirror in which everyone saw what they wanted or feared. Eventually, she returned to public life, but never completely. Instead, her visibility was carefully managed, her image controlled, her appearances rare enough to feel sacred. Over time, this worked. The public grew used to her distance, her age, her widowhood, her long reign. They made her less a person and more an institution. But while the British public might have made peace with their sovereign's privacy, the empire she represented told a more complicated story. Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1876, a symbolic title that reflected Britain's growing imperial reach. But that reach came with conquest, exploitation, and violent suppression. Subjects Victoria rarely addressed directly, but which became central to how her reign is remembered today. She was deeply invested in her role as an imperial figurehead. She learned Hindi phrases, took Indian servants, and developed a close relationship with her Munshi, Abdul Karim, a friendship that caused considerable scandal within the royal household and was eventually erased from official records after her death. To her contemporaries, the scandal wasn't the empire. It was the intimacy, that the queen might place emotional trust in someone outside the aristocracy, and worse, outside the nation. The racial and class dynamics of that relationship rattled the royal household in ways still debated by historians. But modern critics look elsewhere for controversy. Today, Victoria's reign is often re-examined through the lens of empire. The colonization, the cultural erasure, the economic extraction. And while she wasn't the architect of British imperialism, she was its most powerful symbol. Her name became shorthand for domination and discipline. Victorian still evokes a moral rigidity exported alongside armies and railways. Defenders argue that she was a constitutional monarch, a figurehead with limited influence. But this underplays the symbolic weight she carried. Monarchs don't need to sign orders to shape policy. They just need to represent permanence, to give cover to systems they never openly question. And Victoria rarely questioned empire. Her correspondence reveals a genuine belief in the superiority of British civilization. She wrote proudly of her imperial status. She viewed colonized peoples as subjects in need of guidance, not as equals. And while she occasionally expressed humanitarian concern, she did not use her position to challenge the ethics of empire. Her silence once again did the talking. Yet for all this, for the controversies that quietly clung to her reign, Victoria died in 1901 to a nation in mourning. Her funeral was massive. Her legacy declared monumental. She had outlived 7 of her 9 children and presided over a century of transformation. By the end, she seemed inevitable. But inevitability is not the same as clarity. Victoria's reign left behind questions the monarchy still struggles to answer. How does a royal family maintain relevance without overstepping? What happens when symbolism becomes a substitute for leadership? And what's the cost of representing an empire built on contradiction? She remains a figure carved into the cultural memory, draped in black, wielding silence like a scepter, and watching as the world changed around her. And change it did, because in the century after her death, the monarchy would face not just questions of symbolism, but of survival, of how to live in a media age where privacy vanishes and scandal multiplies. And few royals would face that transition more painfully or more publicly than the Queen's own sister, a woman born into duty, trapped by expectation, and torn apart in the press. A modern royal for a modern age, whether she wanted to be or not. 23. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. In a family built on formality, she was a firework. Princess Margaret, younger sister to Queen Elizabeth II, seemed born to disrupt a system that prized silence, stoicism, and carefully filtered perfection. And while she never reigned, never held political office, and never directly shaped the course of national events, She became one of the most controversial royals of the 20th century, not because of power, but because of performance. Because in the age of cameras, headlines, and increasingly democratic appetites, the monarchy's greatest threat wasn't revolution. It was visibility. And Margaret was visible from the start. Born in 1930, she grew up in the shadow of a constitutional shock. Her uncle, Edward VIII, had abdicated the throne for love, making her father, the reserved and reluctant George VI, king. Overnight, Margaret and her older sister Elizabeth became central figures in a monarchy that hadn't planned for them. Elizabeth was serious, composed, dutiful. Margaret was not. Where Elizabeth played the part to perfection, Margaret seemed determined to test the edges of the stage. She was witty, sharp, and striking, the glamorous royal in a post-war world desperately looking for symbols of beauty and modernity. In the 1950s, she was the star of the firm. Young people cut her photo from magazines. Photographers followed her like a movie star. She smoked, wore lipstick, danced until dawn. She was, as one writer put it, royalty with edge. And then came the first real scandal, one that revealed how deeply the monarchy's rules could hurt the people inside it. In the early 1950s, Margaret fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a Royal Air Force officer who had served as an equerry to her father. He was handsome, respectable, and divorced. That single fact made the romance a national crisis. At the time, the Church of England, of which the monarch was supreme governor, prohibited remarriage after divorce if the former spouse was still living. This wasn't just a private affair. It was a constitutional dilemma. The Queen, freshly crowned and only in her 20s, was placed in an impossible position. To support her sister's happiness would be to undercut the church and the institution. To block it would be to risk public sympathy turning against the crown. For a while, the palace delayed. Peter was posted abroad. Margaret was told to wait. Newspapers speculated endlessly. The public, already wary of post-war austerity, sympathized with Margaret's romantic rebellion. In 1955, she issued a statement. She would not marry Townsend, not because she didn't love him, but because of her duty to the Commonwealth. The words were formal. The message was devastating. It was the beginning of a pattern, one Margaret would live out for the rest of her life. She would be both insider and outsider, bound by birth to the monarchy, yet perpetually punished by its boundaries. The public, for a time, loved her for it. In the 1960s, she married photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Earl of Snowdon, the first commoner to marry a king's daughter in over 400 years. Their wedding was broadcast on television to over 300 million people worldwide. It was glamorous, modern, daring. It was also deeply unstable. The Snowdon marriage soon descended into mutual alienation. Both parties had affairs. Both parties appeared in the press more for drama than duty. Their social lives became tabloid currency. Wild parties, foreign holidays, sharp-tongued remarks caught by journalists and eagerly reprinted. For the monarchy, built on the illusion of unity, dignity, and emotional opacity, it was chaos wrapped in diamonds. Margaret's controversies weren't always overt scandals. Often they were quieter, accumulations of behavior that clashed with the royal brand. She was accused of snobbery, of extravagance, of treating the staff poorly, of appearing bored during official functions. She took extended stays on the Caribbean island of Mustique, sometimes during moments of national tension. She once reportedly said of royal duties, "I'm not a committee person." Her defenders argue that she was simply human, more visibly so than her sister. That her mistakes were magnified by a press eager for contrast. That her position, royal but powerless, public but not political, was inherently impossible. They're not wrong. Margaret existed in a gray zone the monarchy had no real precedent for. The spare, in an era where the air was untouchable. Her existence was largely ceremonial, her duties undefined. She was expected to uphold the family's image, but not to speak for it. To be glamorous, but not independent. To be modern, but not too modern. And that tension only deepened as media culture evolved. By the 1970s and 1980s, tabloid journalism had become more aggressive, more invasive, and more hungry for royal dysfunction. Margaret's affairs, her health problems, her strained relationship with her children, all became public fodder. In 1978, her divorce from Lord Snowdon was finalized, the first divorce of a senior royal since Henry VIII. And while the monarchy survived it, the precedent lingered. It chipped away at the illusion of royal marital perfection and set the stage for the much larger crises that would come in the 1990s. Margaret lived long enough to see herself eclipsed, first by Princess Diana, whose popularity and rebellion followed a similar script, but with even higher stakes. Then by a new generation of royals more adept at managing media and message. In her later years, she suffered multiple strokes, became increasingly reclusive, and faded from public view. She died in 2002 at the age of 71, just 7 weeks before the Queen Mother. The funeral was quiet, respectful, a life bracketed by headlines, ending in the shadows. And yet, the questions she left behind have never quite gone away. Was Margaret a tragic figure, a woman crushed by duty and denied happiness by archaic rules? Or was she simply ill-suited for the role she inherited, unable or unwilling to adapt to the changing expectations of royal life? Modern assessments are divided. Some paint her as a symbol of emotional repression, a reminder that even inside palaces, people can be denied their own lives. Others see her as proof of royal privilege gone unchecked, a life of luxury marked by entitlement and missed opportunity. But perhaps the real controversy of Princess Margaret is that she made the royal family feel more real, not in a relatable way, but in a visibly flawed, often uncomfortable one. She didn't pretend to be perfect, and the institution wasn't ready for that. In the end, she didn't break the monarchy, but she cracked the porcelain, and the next royal would step through the shards. A woman whose marriage, public suffering, and eventual death would force the monarchy into its greatest reckoning yet. She wasn't born royal, but she changed royalty forever. 24. Diana, Princess of Wales. If Princess Margaret cracked the porcelain, then Diana, Princess of Wales, shattered the whole glass cabinet. Not with a sword, but with a smile. Not through revolution, but through resonance. She didn't just bend the expectations of royalty, she exposed them. And when the public realized how breakable those expectations were, the institution had to either evolve or risk irrelevance. It's often said that Diana married into the royal family, but in reality, it was the royal family that married into her story, a story that would eclipse theirs, haunt theirs, and ultimately reshape theirs, whether they liked it or not. Diana Spencer was 20 years old when she married Prince Charles in 1981. Shy, soft-spoken, and selected in part for her apparent pliability, she seemed a perfect fit for the role of future queen consort. She was aristocratic but uncontroversial, attractive but not assertive, and critically unexperienced. She was everything the palace thought it could manage. But no one, not the family, not the courtiers, not Diana herself, anticipated what would happen when her emotional vulnerability collided with global fame. From the beginning, the public fell for her. They didn't just admire her, they adopted her. In an age before social media, before constant online presence, Diana became the first truly modern royal celebrity. Her every move was captured, analyzed, published. Her outfits were news. Her gestures were studied. Her smile became one of the most recognized images on earth. And therein lay the first controversy: visibility. The monarchy had always depended on a certain kind of distance, the mystique of duty, the quiet power of staged appearances. Diana reversed that. She was raw, accessible, tactile. She held hands with AIDS patients. She crouched to eye level with children. She hugged people. To a public increasingly suspicious of remote authority, she felt human. To the institution behind her, she felt disruptive. Her marriage to Prince Charles was strained almost from the start. Age difference, personality clashes, and unresolved past relationships all contributed to an emotional divide that became impossible to hide. For years, the palace tried to contain the tension, but Diana, under constant public scrutiny and private pressure, began to speak. Indirectly at first, then directly. In 1992, journalist Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story, a book that revealed the emotional toll of royal life, its isolation, its control, its coldness. Though Diana denied involvement at the time, it was later revealed that she had been Morton's key source. The book wasn't just a bestseller, it was a breach in the palace wall. Then, in 1995, came the interview. Diana sat down with BBC's Panorama and made history with 54 unforgettable minutes of calm devastation. She confirmed affairs. She questioned the institution. And she delivered the line that no royal press secretary could spin away. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. It was a seismic moment, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it, calmly, directly, looking straight into the camera. She wasn't hysterical, she wasn't rebellious, she was controlled, aware, and unmistakably sincere. Public reaction was overwhelming. The monarchy, historically immune to emotional accountability, suddenly looked outdated, unfeeling, vulnerable to its own silence. Within a year, Diana and Charles officially divorced. She lost her HRH, her Royal Highness title, kept her charitable work, and continued to be, as the press would phrase it, the people's princess. The phrase itself was coined, somewhat opportunistically, by then Prime Minister Tony Blair after her death. But its emotional truth had already been proven. Diana belonged to the public in a way no royal before or since ever truly has. Of course, this visibility came at a cost. Every step she took, every vacation, every charitable visit, every date was monitored and monetized. Paparazzi culture exploded during the 1990s, and Diana was its most lucrative subject. She tried to use that spotlight strategically, drawing attention to landmines in Angola, to AIDS treatment, to homelessness and mental health. But the spotlight was unrelenting, and unlike the monarchy, she couldn't hide behind protocol. Her sudden death in 1997, the details of which remain the subject of public obsession and conspiracy, but which all official inquiries ruled accidental, triggered an outpouring of grief the royal family was wholly unprepared for. In London, crowds left mountains of flowers outside Kensington Palace. People wept openly. They shouted at news cameras. They asked one simple question: where is the Queen? That silence, the family's initial refusal to break protocol and respond emotionally, created one of the biggest modern crises of legitimacy that monarchy has ever faced. The public didn't want stoic ceremony. They wanted a statement, a gesture, a sign that the institution cared. Eventually, the Queen addressed the nation. The flags were lowered. The funeral was held, but the damage lingered. For many, Diana's death exposed the emotional bankruptcy of a system that could not adapt to the humanity within it. And yet, the legacy was not destruction. It was evolution. The royal family changed after Diana, sometimes superficially, sometimes structurally. They became more visible, more responsive, more emotionally performative. William and Harry were raised differently. Public relations strategies were modernized. Charitable outreach became a cornerstone of royal engagement. But Diana's shadow remains. Every time a royal ventures into difficult terrain, mental health, social inequality, international diplomacy, the comparison is made. Every time a member of the family struggles with press intrusion, the warnings resurface. And every time the institution tries to present itself as modern, Diana is there in the background, a reminder of what happens when humanity and hierarchy collide. Today, assessments of Diana are layered. Some view her as a tragic figure, manipulated by both family and media, praised and punished in equal measure. Others see her as a political force, not in policy, but in symbolism, who forced a 1,000-year-old institution to reckon with the 20th century. She was flawed, brilliant, impulsive, compassionate, and often reckless. But above all, she was real, which, in the theater of monarchy, is both dangerous and unforgettable. Her legacy is a question. Can royalty survive transparency? Because the modern crown doesn't exist in castles anymore. It exists on screens. And the next royal in this saga, not a spouse, not a symbol, but a son of the queen herself, would learn that truth the hard way. Not through tragedy, but through scandal. 25. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. In the sprawling narrative of the modern British monarchy, there's rarely been a figure who fell from grace quite like Prince Andrew. He was once the action hero prince, the dashing naval officer, war veteran, helicopter pilot, and Queen's favorite, a royal with swagger, medals, and media appeal. But that image, carefully cultivated through the 1980s and 1990s, now lies buried beneath one of the most damaging reputational collapses in the House of Windsor's recent history. And this time, there was no tragic undertone, no noble sacrifice, no bittersweet complexity, just a slow, excruciating descent into scandal that turned a working royal into a walking liability. Andrew, Duke of York, is the second son of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Born in 1960, he was the first child of a reigning monarch born in over a century. From early on, he cut a striking figure, adventurous, charismatic, and often described as more fun-loving than his older brother, the future King Charles III. While Charles was cerebral and restrained, Andrew was physical and exuberant. His military career offered early promise. He served with distinction during the Falklands War in 1982, flying multiple combat missions. For a brief time, he earned a genuine reputation as a royal who had seen real action. Not just ceremonial appearances, but life and death situations. It gave him credibility and admiration. He was brave, photogenic, and marketable. But as time passed, the stories began to shift. Where once he was known for service, he became known for excess. He earned the nickname Air Miles Andy for his frequent international travel, often at public expense. There were stories of lavish trips, luxury hotel stays, and connections with oligarchs and controversial foreign leaders. His time as the UK's Special Representative for Trade and Investment from 2001 to 2011 was supposed to make use of his global profile, but instead it raised uncomfortable questions about who he associated with and why. Then came the association that would define his downfall, his friendship with financier Jeffrey Epstein. By the late 2000s, Epstein was already a subject of serious criminal investigations and public scrutiny. Despite this, Prince Andrew maintained a friendship with him, even after Epstein had served time in prison. In 2010, Andrew was photographed walking with him in Central Park shortly after Epstein's release. The optics were catastrophic. Questions mounted, defenses faltered, and the palace's traditional never complain, never explain strategy began to collapse under the weight of media pressure. But it was the 2019 BBC Newsnight interview that turned a festering controversy into a full-blown institutional crisis. In an attempt to clear his name and explain his connection to Epstein, Andrew agreed to a sit-down interview with journalist Emily Maitlis. What followed was one of the most widely criticized media appearances in modern royal history. He appeared defensive, evasive, and remarkably unempathetic. He delivered implausible statements that were instantly ridiculed. His demeanor, far from clearing the air, only amplified public skepticism. The backlash was swift and brutal. Within days, charities and organizations began severing ties. Headlines were relentless. Satirists had a field day. And perhaps most damning of all, the palace acted. Prince Andrew stepped back from royal duties indefinitely. His official patronages evaporated. In 2022, following continued legal developments and public pressure, he was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages entirely, and no longer used His Royal Highness in any official capacity. It was not exile exactly, but it was the royal equivalent of pulling the curtain. The Queen, ever strategic in managing public perception, had to walk a delicate line. Andrew remained her son, but he was also now a threat to the institution. His appearances became rare, his role was eliminated, and his story became a warning. Modern historians and royal commentators largely agree on one thing. Prince Andrew's fall was uniquely damaging because it struck at the monarchy's credibility in the 21st century. It wasn't just about personal conduct. It was about accountability, trust, judgment. Unlike earlier controversies that could be buried under silence or contained within palace walls, this one unfolded in real time, global, digital, and relentless. And it posed a harder question than the usual tabloid noise. What does the monarchy do when the scandal isn't historic or distant, but sitting within the Queen's own immediate family? There are no satisfying answers, no grand redemption arc. Prince Andrew's status remains suspended in public doubt. Not erased, but certainly unrecoverable. And the damage isn't isolated. It leaves lingering stains on the crown's image, especially in an age where institutions are expected to answer for more than tradition. If Diana forced the royal family to appear emotionally modern, Andrew forced them to confront their vulnerabilities in real-world terms. Legal, ethical, reputational. And as we reach the end of this chronicle of controversy, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. The English crown has never been immune to scandal. It has merely survived it, sometimes through silence, sometimes through spectacle, and sometimes simply by waiting long enough for the world to look away.